back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Now we're diving into the madness the Red Corsairs are causing in the Maelstrom. Before we get into that, be sure to like, comment your videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I'll be killing it like always. Now, let's get into the video.
The Maelstrom did not resemble a storm so much as a lesion in the skin of creation, a bruise upon the void where reality had been struck too many times and never permitted to heal. It sprawled across the night like a wound torn open by a god's claw, immense beyond sane measure, ringed by false lightning and the corpse light of drowned stars. Color bled where no color should have been. Distance folded in upon itself. Light came back wrong. It bent, curdled, thinned into greasy veils, then flared again in impossible angles, so that distant hulks seemed close enough to touch, and neighboring vessels hung like ghosts at the bottom of an abyss. Vox prayers dissolved before they reached the mouths that birthed them. Machine spirits howled in encrypted agony. Ships vanished whole, not exploding, not dying, merely ceasing, as if some colossal predator lurking beneath the fabric of existence had opened its jaws and swallowed them without ripple or trace. Through that unreality limped the strike cruiser widow's gospel, a predator reduced to a crippled scavenger. Her flanks were torn open in a dozen places where old macro shells had bitten deep and newer patches of salvage plating had been welded over scars still wet with leaking oils. One of her dorsal lance housings was a blackened ruin. Two of her primary batteries had gone silent 3 days before, their ammunition feeds spent and their magazines cored by chain detonations during a running fight in the Stormwood deeps. The cruiser's once proud hide of midnight armor was streaked with cinders, frozen blood and warp frost. She looked less like a warship than a carcass that had remembered how to keep moving. Inside her, men and monsters endured. The lower holds stank of promethium fumes, spoiled meat, hot metal, and the old copper reek of blood trapped in deck grills. Mortal serfs shuffled through corridors lit by dying lumen strips, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, their hands quick whenever armored. Footsteps approached. The slaves fed the furnaces, dragged the shells, hauled the dead to rendering vats, and whispered of mutiny in the dark with all the conviction of men who longed to rebel and knew they would be flayed alive before the first blade left its sheath. The bridge crews were no better. Gunnery ratings stared at empty munitions displays with the despair of priests before broken altars. Apothecarian thralls inventoried gene stock canisters that should have been plentiful, and instead lay in ranks so thin they looked like a joke played by a cruel god. The legionaries of the warband did not speak openly of want, because Astartes were not beggars, but they felt the ship's poverty in every grinding bulkhead and every dry magazine rack. The command sanctum shuddered as the widow's gospel pushed through another tide lash of empiric turbulence. Bronze cherub skulls swung on chains above the hololithic tank. Auspec's runes smeared, vanished, reappeared. A slave at the Vox shrine began reciting the litany of safe transmission and choked halfway through when the speaker grill exhaled a wet animal shriek in reply. He flinched, forgot himself, and made the sign of the Aquila across his chest. Sev Drask put a bolt round through the back of the man's head before anyone else could turn. The slave's face burst apart in a fan of brains and shattered teeth. The corpse pitched across the console, fingers twitching as blood sheeted over brass keys and flickering display lenses. He was praying to the wrong empire, Sev said. His voice came through his helm grill as a flattened growl of static and amusement. He was standing beside the Strategium pit with his chainblade maglocked to one thigh and his gauntleted hands resting lightly on the rail, as relaxed as a duelist at sport. Fresh strips of flayed skin hung from his left pauldron, still nailed there from a raid 2 nights before. The skins twitched every time the deck trembled, like pale tongues licking. The black ceramite. No one rebuked him. No one thanked him either. The brothers of the warband stood about the chamber in their usual crooked geometry of contempt. They wore battle plate the color of midnight and old bruises, skull-faced helms and trophy chains heavy with finger bones, dog tags, vertebrae, and the teeth of men who had screamed too slowly. They had bled together for decades. They had killed for one another. They did not like one another in the slightest. At the far end of the sanctum, on a throne hacked together from gunmetal, cabling, and the spine of a loyalist champion, Karen Vale convulsed. The seizure struck him without warning. One moment he sat with his helm in his lap and his dead black hair clotted to his brow with sweat, watching the hololith tremble. The next, his back arched so violently the throne groaned beneath him. His fingers clenched. Blood ran from his nose and from the corners of his eyes in thread-thin trails. His teeth ground hard enough to crack. The mortal attendants nearby recoiled, and one of them made a sound like a kicked animal before remembering that to show pity to a Night Lord was a form of suicide. Karen saw none of them. He was elsewhere. He was in the wound. He was falling through a sky made of screaming mouths. Lightning forked in colors with no names. 1,000 ships drifted in a red abyss, their hulls split, their innards hanging out in ropes of steel and frozen corpses. Voices called to him from inside the thunder. They did not shout. They whispered, intimate as blades against skin. Karen, Karen Vale, son of a dead son, come deeper. He saw the widow's gospel from beyond herself, a wounded black knife afloat upon a sea of burning oil. He saw chains descending from the dark and hooking into her ribs. He saw a fortress built within the throat of the storm, assembled from wrecks, bastions, shrine debris, pirate docks, and the bones of 100 conquered fleets. He saw gun decks the size of hive districts. He saw execution yards. He saw vaults swelling with plunder. He saw worlds at the edge of the Maelstrom burning one by one, their populations fed into slavery, sacrifice, and ammunition. He saw green tides crashing through shattered starports. He saw sleek Xenos silhouettes cutting through fire with contemptuous grace. He saw traitor flotillas rising from the storm like schools of carrion fish. And above it all, at the rotten heart of the Empire, he saw a throne of iron and fire occupied by a crippled tyrant who had made a kingdom of damnation. Then the voice came again, no longer a whisper, but a murmur spoken directly into the raw tissue of his mind. I know your name. Karen tore back into himself with a snarl that sounded almost like a sob. He pitched forward off the throne, one gauntlet hitting the deck hard enough to dent it. Blood dripped from his chin. His bare face looked cadaverous in the half-light, high cheekbones drawn tight over predatory hollows, eyes too large and too bright. Morval crouched beside him, not to help but to observe. The apothecary's armor was bulkier than the others, his narthecium folded across one arm like a slumbering parasite. Surgical syringes and bone saws trembled on mechadendrites above his shoulders. His voice was dry, almost bored. You did not bite through your own tongue this time. Improvement. Karen wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. I heard it. Sev laughed softly. The prophet hears. We are saved. Karen looked up, and the chamber seemed to shrink around the focus of his stare. The Maelstrom is calling us by name. That earned silence, which among Night Lords was a degree of respect. Then Sev broke it anyway. Perhaps it wants to mock us before it eats us. Another of the legionaries, old Varjast, leaned against a pillar of flensed bronze and spat a clot of black blood through his helm grill. Or perhaps the visions are fever from tainted air and starvation. We are low on gene stock, low on rounds, and lower still on patience. I would blame material concerns before assigning agency to a warp saw. Karen rose slowly. You think I do not know the taste of madness? I think, said Varjast, that you have always worn it better than the rest of us. Sev gave a bark of amusement. Morval said nothing. His helm lenses narrowed on the blood still crawling from Karen's nostrils. There it was, as it always was among them. Loyalty without affection. Brotherhood with every tooth still bared. They would kill for Karen. They would die beside him. They would gut his pride and laugh at the sound it made. A klaxon coughed once, twice, then steadied into a harsh pulse. The hololith snapped into coherence for the briefest of moments. A cluster of returns bloomed on the edge of the display, ghosting in and out through the storm static. Bridge Surf Harm, the one senior enough to have earned a name rather than a number, bent over the auger shrine. Contacts, closing in a disciplined spread, running dark between lightning surges, too tight for carrion craft, too clean for scavengers. Sev's helm turned toward the display. At last, the returns multiplied. 6, then 10, then more behind them, hidden in distortion. Lean warships with clipped signatures, engines throttled low, approach angles predatory and patient. Their formation was that of hunters easing around wounded prey, not because they feared it, but because they preferred to keep all avenues of escape under control. The Vox shrine hissed. Runes crawled. One of the cherub skulls mounted above it began weeping black machine oil from its empty eye sockets. A voice cut through the static. "This is Reeve, Captain Dagon Varkas of the Red Corsairs. Unidentified cruiser. You trespass within the tyrant's dominion. Power down your dorsal batteries. Kill your active auger sweeps and alter course to Vector 7 by carrion. Mark, resist and be opened like meat." There was no greeting in the tone, no fellowship, no offer. It was the voice of a jailer informing a condemned man that his cell had been prepared. Karen stepped to the Vox dais and keyed the rune himself. "You address the widow's gospel of the 8th Legion. We seek anchorage, resupply and passage." A pause. Static crackled. Somewhere in it, for the span of a heartbeat, laughter seemed to whisper. Then Dagon replied, "Seek all you like. You have arrived. Accept sanctuary and submit to escort." Sanctuary. The word was spoken with such measured contempt that even the serfs felt the edge in it. Sev rested one hand on the hilt of his chain blade. "Hear that, brothers. The pirate dogs invite us into their kennel." Varjast gave a low chuckle. "If they mean to kennel us, they have sent a great many leashes." The view screen shutters peeled open across the forward wall, and the void flooded in. The Maelstrom boiled beyond. The armor glass, a red and violet enormity laced with corpse-white flares. The Red Corsair Squadron emerged by degrees from that infernal splendor, their hulls blackened, crimson, adorned with chains and boarding talons, and battle scars worn not as shame, but advertisement. They moved with insulting confidence. Gunports tracked the Widow's gospel in perfect silence. Attack craft drifted between them like feeding insects. Beyond them lay proof that the storm had not merely spawned raiders, it had crowned them. Wreckfields ringed the approach lanes in morbid constellations. Astartes vessels, long dead, floated beside merchantmen, split stem to stern. Navy escorts without prows tumbled slowly through space amidst pilgrim ships whose shrine decks had been burned hollow. There were butcher ships hung with corpses from keel to mast. Scavenger craft gnawed at derelicts with cutting beams, stripping armor and flesh alike. Hulks had been chained together into floating redoubts studded with cannons. Entire grave fields of broken fleets orbited in the storm's mouth, not abandoned, but repurposed, every carcass made useful in the economy of ruin. Harm swallowed audibly. "By all the dark," Sev backhanded him without looking. The surf flew into a console hard enough to break his jaw. Karen ignored both. His gaze had gone past the wrecks, past the Corsair escort, out to the wider dark where system lights flickered and died one after another upon the edge of the storm. There, through layers of static and magnification wash, he saw worlds burning. One planet wore a necklace of orbital fires, where void stations had been broken open and left tumbling. Another showed continent-spanning smears of bombardment heat crawling across its night side. Farther off, in the shadow of gas giants and dust lanes, ships hunted ships in swarms. The war zone beyond the escort screen was vast. Not a single battle, but an archipelago of slaughter, traitor raids, Xenos predation, free, companies of murderers. Entire populations were being harvested at the fringes of the Maelstrom, while astropaths screamed into the void for aid that would arrive too late, or not at all. Billions were already dead. More would die before this watch ended. The storm had become a market, and war was its currency. Morval came to stand at Karen's shoulder. "You were right." Karen's expression hardened. "No, I was merely not blind enough." The ship shuddered as the Widow's Gospel altered course under the guns of her escort. Crew chant from the engine decks rose over the Vox net, ragged and desperate. Somewhere below, 2 surf gangs came to blows over ration allotments and were cut apart by overseers. The cruiser limped onward, dignified only by stubbornness. Then Karen saw it. At first, it seemed a mountain adrift in the void. Then the false perspective of the storm shifted, and the thing unfolded into its true enormity. A fortress, yes, but no imperial bastion had ever been this profane. It was assembled from the corpses of fleets and the architecture of theft. Grand cruiser prows had been built into curtain walls. Orbital plates formed tiered gun platforms bristling with macro cannon. Cathedral spires, wrenched from conquered worlds, jutted upside down from docking spars. Armor-glass domes the size of hive blocks glowed with bruised light. Chain arrays, thicker than city bridges, anchored drifting bastions around the core mass. Dry docks clung to its flanks like iron parasites. Fires burned in 1,000 ports. Lances tracked. Defense moons turned in lockstep around it. It sat half within the storm and half without, as if even the Maelstrom itself had learned to make room for its master. Not refuge, Karen thought. Not a lair, an empire. Huron Blackheart had not hidden in damnation. He had ruled it. The red corsair vessels widened their formation and shepherded the Widow's Gospel toward a cavernous intake dock cut into the fortress's lower mass. Vox orders barked from every channel. New target locks crawled across the command display until the hololith was almost white with them. Every gun deck in sight seemed to wake and turn. Weapon spirits tasted the Night Lords across vacuum. The sensation was physical, like the pressure of knives against the throat. "Kill all external lumens," Dagon ordered over the Vox. "Bleed drive output to docking minimum. Any deviation will be interpreted as defiance." One by one, the Widow's Gospel obeyed. Her running lights died. Her scarred hull sank into shadow. The bridge dimmed until only warning runes and the red wash of failing displays lit the faces and helms within. Sev's chuckle rasped in the dark. "We enter a king's court like prisoners." Karen wiped the last of the blood from beneath his nose and watched the fortress eclipse the storm. "No," he said, "like meat." The Widow's Gospel crossed into the shadow of Huron's dominion with every lumen, extinguished, and every gun in the void aimed at her heart. The docking clamps bit into the Widow's Gospel with a force that shivered through every deck and bulkhead like the closing of a predator's jaws. For a few heartbeats, there was only the grinding protest of tortured metal, the hiss of pressure equalization, and the low, unclean thrum of void shields layered thick around the fortress beyond. Then the first impact sounded against the outer boarding lock. Not a knock, a demand. Heavy, measured, deliberate. Karen Vale stood in the mustering chamber with his helm sealed and his chain blade maglocked across his back, listening to the sound echo through the ribs of his dying ship. Around him, his chosen claw waited in silence, broken only by armor servos and the wet coughs of deck slaves dragging aside the corpse of a serf crushed during docking. Sev Drask rolled one shoulder to settle his pauldron. Varyast checked the edge alignment on his chainglaive with priestly care. Morval stood apart with his narthecium folded close, his armor draped in stained Medicae cables and bone vials that clicked together when he moved. No one spoke of the position they were in. Night Lords did not preserve their dignity by naming its absence. The second impact shook rust from the arch above the inner lock. A red lumen flared. The hatch split and rolled aside. Red corsairs filled the threshold. They wore crimson and black plate slashed with old campaign scars. Their armor marked by hooks, chains, stolen sigils, and the personal trophies of a breed of warrior that had never mistaken cruelty for art. Their bolters were already raised. Their leader stepped forward with the unhurried assurance of a man who knew that every wall, gun deck and murder slit around him belonged to his master. His helm was horned by shark-toothed veins, his left gauntlet built for boarding claws rather than elegance. "Disarm," he said. Sev gave a voxed laugh. "Come and try." The Corsair leader did not react. "You are expected alive. Nothing was said about your pride." Karen lifted a hand before Sev's insolence could curdle into a massacre. "Name yourself." "Reeve Captain Dagon Varkas. You heard me on the Vox." He glanced over the Night Lords one by one, his gaze lingering on the cracks in their plate, the dried blood in their joint seals, the thinness of their ammunition harnesses. His contempt was not theatrical. It was practical. "Bring only what you carry already. Additional munitions remain on your ship. You are guests until instructed otherwise." "Guests." Sev tilted his head. There is that kennel speech again. Dagon ignored him. "The tyrant grants audience. Be grateful your ship still has atmosphere enough to walk out of." The route through the fortress was a sermon in iron. They were marched through corridors big enough for armored vehicles, then through narrower arteries where the walls sweated machine oil and incense smoke. Every passageway bore the marks of plundered empires welded into a single doctrine of theft. Imperial deck shrines had been torn from their native hulls and rebuilt upside down into archways. Segments of Mechanicus latticework supported galleries whose parapets were cast from the broken eagles of conquered navy craft. The decks changed underfoot every few hundred paces, one section ribbed and utilitarian, the next paved in cracked marble engraved with saints now faceless from deliberate mutilation. Everywhere there were guns. Deck turrets tracked the Night Lords with patient machine attention. Murder servitors hung dormant in alcoves with chain blades folded like the limbs of carrion insects. Red lumens burned low, the color of old clots. They passed the cages first. Hundreds of them hung in a shaft that plunged down through the fortress's interior like the throat of some immense carnivore. Some cages held mortal prisoners in rags, skin drawn tight over bone, too, weak, even to curse, as the escort passed. Some held deserters in pieces, their limbs removed and replaced with devotional hooks so they could not collapse. Others contained things whose humanity had been negotiated away by warp exposure, mutilation, or surgery. One cage held a pair of astropaths chained face to face by collars driven through their lower jaws. Their eyelids had been sewn open. Black tears tracked down their cheeks. Their lips moved in exhausted unison around prayers that had long ago ceased to reach any god but pain. A little farther on came the trophy decks. The ceiling rose into a grand gallery where the dead had been arranged with the vanity of a collector. Loyalist champions in shattered plate were nailed to bronze pylons in poses of supplication. Xenos skulls hung in chains from vaulted beams. Whole void suits, still occupied by the mummified remains inside them, rotated slowly in fields of static containment, as if caught forever in the instant of explosive decompression. There were banners taken from imperial regiments, trader dynasties, pirate bands and cults too obscure for even Karen to name. Some had been daubed over with the fanged sigil of the Red Corsairs. Some had been left intact, not out of respect, but because conquest required witnesses. They passed rows of impaled deserters after that, and those were somehow worse. The deserters had been driven onto shipbreaker spikes that rose from a trench of black water running down the center of a long hall. Some were mortal voidsmen. Some wore the remains of flak harnesses or the stolen uniforms of planetary militias. Two had once been transhumans, or enough of one for the bulk of their bones and muscle to suggest it. None were dead. Huron's chirurgeons had seen to that. Nutrient drips fed them. Waste tubes drained them. Their skins had split around the spikes and healed there in glossy red welds. They twitched and moaned when the procession passed. Morval slowed beside one of the transhuman corpses, examining the musculature beneath the stretched skin. Interesting, Dagon's head turned fractionally. "You may request specimens later." "Specimens," Sev murmured, amused. "Hear him. Not brothers, not allies. Meet with transaction value." "That," said Dagon without looking back, "is why your legion still starves while ours rules." The audience chamber lay behind vault doors thick as bunker walls, guarded by Terminators in crimson and black, who stood as still as statuary until the doors began to open. Then their weapons tilted as one, and Karen felt the pressure of target locks prickling over his armor like cold rain. The chamber beyond had once been an Imperial Strategium, or a cathedral annex. Both identities had been gutted and rebuilt into something more honest. The roof vanished into incense haze. Chains descended from the darkness with censers, skull lamps, and flayed banners hanging from them. A hololithic projector burned, in the middle of the floor, casting a many-layered image of a star region, broken by static storms and threat runes. Around it stood thrones, not elegant, not symmetrical, but assembled from the remains of many conquered designs. Iron, brass, bone, fragments of command pulpits and execution chairs welded together into seats for predators. Huron Blackheart occupied the highest of them. He was not a handsome ruin. He was a victorious one. The tyrant of the Maelstrom sat beneath a bank of dim lumen globes like a thing dragged back from death so often that death itself had grown weary of the argument. What flesh remained visible on his face and throat was pale, stretched, scar-crossed, and seamed with augmetic joins. One side of his chest was a fortress of armor plating, pistons and reinforced cables where the original body had failed and iron had taken the burden. Servo mechanisms hissed softly beneath the blackened ceramite casing over one shoulder. His gauntlet looked less forged than engineered for strangulation. Yet none of that was what struck hardest. It was the stillness. He did not need to loom or thunder. He sat half reclined, as if entertaining himself with lesser men's desperation, and the room belonged to him so completely that every other presence became an annotation to his silence. When he smiled, it was a small thing, a private movement at the corner of his mouth, but it made the chamber feel colder. At Huron's right shoulder stood Garyon the Corpse Master, vast and clinical, his armor a shrine to mutilated discipline. Surgical mechadendrites rose around him in a steel halo tipped with saws, injectors, clamps, and reductor drills. His torso was hung with apothecarian canisters marked in old blood and preservation runes. Lenses clicked and whirred where eyes should have been. He looked over the Night Lords not as warriors, but as a butcher might look over livestock that had survived a hard winter and therefore merited a more attentive skinning. At Huron's left stood Garland's Soul Eater, draped in crimson-black robes over sorcerous warplate chased with runes that shifted when stared at too long. His face was narrow and devoutly cruel, his eyes sunk deep and bright with the kind of intelligence that mistook manipulation for piety. He studied Karen at once, and Karen felt it, the same way one feels a blade testing the gap beneath a rib. Dagon halted and bowed his head. My tyrant, the Night Lords. Huron looked at them for a time that became uncomfortable, precisely because he allowed it to. Then he spoke, his voice low and iron dry. Wounded things travel far when they smell shelter. Sev's helm tilted, and carrion kings grow generous when they smell wounded things. A few bolters shifted. Garyon's servo arms flexed. Garland smiled without warmth. Huron only seemed faintly entertained. Which one is this? Karen Vale did not think him important enough to name, Sev said. Karen did not turn his head. Sevdrask, he mistakes insolence for immunity. Huron's gaze settled on Karen again. And you mistake formal speech for leverage, yet here you are. Karen took a step forward, not enough to be construed as challenge, enough to deny cowering. We are here because the Maelstrom admits few roads and fewer refugees. We seek terms. No. Huron leaned the slightest fraction in his throne. Soft piston noise whispered within his chest. You seek relief. Terms are what I offer. He gestured once, and the hololithic display shifted. A world burned into view. Shrine hives, orbital rings, defense grids, troop concentrations, processional causeways visible from orbit like devotional scars cut into the planet's skin. Gethsemane Tertius, Huron said. A tithe world at the edge of useful imperial territory. It guards a corridor of shipping and reinforcement routes, which the corpse-thrown servants still imagine secure. Beneath one of its principal shrine hives lies an ancient chart engine, entombed in catacombs older than the Imperium's lie. The Noctis Compass. The name moved through the chamber like a draft from an opened grave. Garland watched Charon carefully. Morval's helm turned by a fraction. Sev made no sound this time. Huron continued. It can read stable courses where others see madness. It can mark safe veins through the storm, if one has the will to master it. I intend to possess it intact. Then send your own curs, Sev said. Dagon's hand drifted toward his sidearm. Watch your tongue. No, Huron said, and the single word stilled the room. He kept his eyes on Charon. Your legion's remnants excel at terror penetration, attritional slaughter, and surviving conditions that kill more disciplined men. You know how to move through darkness with little support. You know how to make populations panic. You are also desperate enough to be useful. Charon answered in a voice scraped clean of warmth. We are not mercenaries. Everyone is a mercenary, Huron said. Some are merely deluded about the currency. Garion stepped forward at last. A mechadendrite extended from his back and clicked against the edge of Charon's pauldron. Another swept past Sev, then Var-Jast, then Morval, tasting power signatures, seal integrity, residual bio-readings. He spoke like a Medici clerk reciting inventory. Armor degradation severe, joint wear extensive, ammunition deficit obvious, gene seed stores nearly exhausted, organ stress elevated. Several battle brothers show evidence of repeated suboptimal implantation harvest and chemical compensation. This warband is being held together by habit, malice, and remarkably poor maintenance. Morval gave a low, voxed chuckle. From a chirurgeon draped in patchwork corpses, that stings. Garion turned his head with insect precision. You preserve decline, I correct it. You tax it, Sevi said. I monetize viability, Garion replied. There was the Red Corsair creed in its naked form. Not brotherhood, not devotion. Utility measured in blood, shells, hull tonnage, and fear. Charon said, your campaign does not concern us. Everything in the Maelstrom concerns you now, Huron said, because you entered my dark and lived, because your ship cannot feed itself, because your wounded need chirurgeons, because your magazines are hungry, because I know want when I smell it. He made another small gesture. A side gate ground open. The Night Lord's wounded were brought in under guard. Not all of them. Enough. Legionaries from the Widow's Gospel who had been left in the Apothecarian, some upright through stubbornness, others on slabs or chain gurneys. One was missing both lower arms and had crude pressure bungs hammered into the stumps. Another had half his face flensed away by shrapnel, so that one eye stared from a mask of exposed cheekbone and teeth. 3 were still locked into Medici harnesses because their spines would not bear their own armor weight. Mortal attendants from the ship came with them, dragged by collar chains, their expressions already ruined by the knowledge that their lives were examples, and therefore already forfeit. Charon felt the insult like a blade in the mouth. Sev took one step forward before Var-Jast's hand closed on his arm. Huron's voice remained almost conversational. This is what you are at present. Not legends, not heirs of old terrors, not princes of the long war. Inventory, diminishing inventory. He let the image stand in the air a moment longer. I can restore your stocks. I can mend your wounded, replenish your magazines, refuel your ship, and allow you to leave my domain with enough strength to go on murdering lesser men for another span of years. Or I can do nothing. Your crippled will drift here. Your gene seed will decay. Your serfs will eat one another in the holds. My docks will strip your cruiser in useful sections after the final failure cascade. Some of your brothers may even survive long enough to resent it. Sev's voice dropped to a knife's whisper. I will open your throat for that. Huron smiled. It was not a wide smile. It was worse. It was the look of a man amused by a familiar animal baring its teeth from behind a broken fence. You may try. The terminators at the doors shifted their weight. Target locks multiplied. Garion's tools unfolded farther with a wet hum. Garland took one step nearer the hololith, not alarmed, simply interested. Then the sorcerer spoke for the first time. He has seen something, Garland said, eyes never leaving Karen. Not merely storm sickness, not merely fever. The Maelstrom has leaned close enough to breathe on him. Karen met his gaze. And you think that increases my value? I know that it does. Garland's smile was thin as a stitch. Men, ships, ammunition, these are always useful. A mind the storm has chosen to whisper into is rarer merchandise. Careful, Sev said. He will start charging by the vision. Huron rose. That was when the room truly understood what his body had become. Armor pistons locked and released beneath his frame, with sounds like the cocking of execution devices. The throne itself seemed to protest, relinquishing his weight. One leg bore him on iron reinforcement and hidden hydraulics. A web of black cables flexed at his gorget, feeding power and stimulants into whatever remained of the original anatomy. Yet when he stood, the injuries ceased to matter. He was not diminished. He was weaponized survival, a body too angry to die and too useful to pity. He descended one step from the throne dais. No more than that. He did not need the distance closed. Here is the bargain, Huron said. You and your claw descend with Dagon's forces upon Gethsemane Tertius. You break what resists. You find the catacomb, rout beneath the shrine hive. You help secure the Noctis compass intact. In return, your wounded are treated. Your holds are replenished. Your ship leaves my docks stronger than it entered them. And if we refuse, Karen said. Huron's gaze flicked to the displayed wounded, then back. You have already seen the answer. Karen was silent. He thought of the empty canisters in the apothecarian, of the shell racks with more dust than munitions, of the mutterings in the lower holds, of the voice in the storm whispering his name as if it had known him since before Nostramo's son had died. He thought of Gethsemane Tertius, a world he had never seen and already despised, where something ancient slept under prayer stone and martyr bones. He thought of the fact that Huron wanted it intact. That alone made the thing dangerous enough to matter. Sev leaned closer, Vox muting his words to the Night Lords alone. Say no, and we die slowly in his cage, Varjast answered on, the same private channel. Say yes, and we die usefully in someone else's war. Morval added, dry as old parchment, with medical support. Karen almost laughed at that. It came out as a breath through his grill. Then he inclined his head the barest degree toward Huron Blackheart, which in that room was as near to kneeling as a Night Lord would ever willingly come. We accept, he said. Every syllable tasted like rust. The widow's gospel and her remaining claw will join your assault on Gethsemane Tertius. Huron's smile returned, faint and satisfied. You see, he said softly. Terms. Karen said nothing more. He did not trust his voice with anything but violence, and violence here would merely prove Huron correct. The tyrant resumed his throne as if the matter were already settled in every possible future. Dagon bowed once and turned to lead the Night Lords out. Garion was already issuing calm orders for the transfer of the wounded, listing treatments, salvage priorities, and acceptable loss thresholds in the same tone another man might use to order supplies. Garland watched Karen until the chamber doors began to close, his gaze bright with the greedy patience of a man who believed prophecy could be harvested like organs. As the vault doors thundered shut behind them and the escort closed ranks once more, Sev let out a slow breath through his helm vents. "Well done," he said. "We have purchased survival by volunteering for a richer death." Karen looked back once at the sealed audience chamber, at the walls that kept Huron's court warm and the rest of the dark starving. "No," he said. "He purchased us. The only question left is how long before he spends what he bought." They walked on through the iron arteries of the fortress, while chained astropaths wept and deserters moaned on their spikes, and every step deeper into Huron's dominion felt less like rescue than a slower execution. By the time the widow's gospel was cut loose from her repair gantries, the fortress around her had become a living thing of war. Nothing in Huron Blackheart's dominion ever seemed fully at rest. Even in the outer anchorage, where broken ships were lashed together in chained orbits around defense bastions and dock towers, the void crawled with labor and threat. Salvage craft darted between hulls, dragging severed armor plates, reactor shielding, crates of shells, racks of torpedoes, chains of prisoners, flayed banners, fuel bladders, corpse sacks, and butchered engine parts. Tugs groaned under the strain of pulling scrap-built gun platforms into position. Ugly islands of iron and cannons dragged on kilometer-long chains behind mastiff-nosed void tractors. Beast haulers drifted under guard, their containment holds lit by the red pulse of stun grids, something huge and enraged hammering within each pen. Slave transports hung low and broad, packed so densely with bodies that their heat vents steamed. Strike cruisers floated above it all with the cold poise of apex predators, accompanied by raiders, looted escorts, hacked merchant hulls converted into munitions lighters, boarding craft nests, and attack carrier barges stitched together from generations of theft. The fleet was not handsome in the way the imperial warships of old propaganda had once promised. It was beautiful only in the way a mass grave could be beautiful to flies. Every vessel bore scars. Every hull had been broken and repaired too many times. Prows were mismatched, armor patched, shrine chambers gutted into magazines, lance decks rebuilt from scavenged architecture, and Xenos alloy in places where no proper forge had ever signed its blessing. Yet there was discipline in the aggregation. Lines of fire overlapped. Assault paths were clear. Resupply moved with relentless efficiency. The pirate kingdom breathed through its dockyards and mustering anchors as a single predatory organism. Karen stood on the command pulpit of the Widow's Gospel and watched it all through the armoured bays of the Strategium. The fortress eclipsed half the starfield beyond, a black-red continent in the void. From every dock mouth and launch cradle, war emerged. "They are not raiders any longer," Varjast said from the shadows behind him. "They are a state." Sev Drask snorted over the private vox. "A state of rot, perhaps." Morval had no attention for the fleet at all. He was bent over a suspended rack of gene seed canisters, recently transferred from one of Huron's Medici vaults. His mechadendrites moving with obscene tenderness through ranks of glass cylinders and preservation coils. Behind him, on slab frames chained to the deck, lay the bodies of Red Corsairs dead in recent boarding actions, their armor removed, their black carapaces split open under the apothecary's sawwork. Servitor scribes recorded everything in clicking Binharic monotones. Dagon Varkas had provided the corpses without reluctance. That alone had been instructive. The Red Corsair captain arrived aboard the Widow's Gospel without ceremony and without asking permission, his escort of lean, red-armored killers spreading through the Strategium like they already owned the deck. Karen saw at once why these were favoured among Huron's spear-tip companies. They moved with the economy of men who killed for positional advantage rather than intoxication. Their war plate was lighter than that of line legionaries, stripped of excess plate weight where speed mattered, reinforced where boarding hooks and breaching charges made close ruin inevitable. Grapnels, melter cutters, demolition satchels, and compact ammunition harnesses hung from them in neat arrangement. No trophy chains cluttered their limbs, no skins swayed from their armor. They wore their violence with purpose rather than display. Red Corsair raiders, Karen thought. Not artists of terror, professionals of entry. Dagon crossed the chamber and stabbed a clawed finger toward the hololithic spread hovering over the central pit. "You will deploy with the second descent wave," he said. "My raiders take the starport crowns, the macro battery precincts, and the principal transit locks. Once those are cut open, your claw drives into the lower hive districts and fractures civil cohesion." Sev let out a low chuckle. Civil cohesion. Hear the Void Pirate speak like a clerk. "Words matter when objectives do," Dagon replied. "The planet is not the prize. Panic is useful only if it clears roads and breaks command response. We are not descending merely to drench masonry in blood." Karen did not take his eyes from the display. "No, you are descending to seize a world's throat before anyone else knows you have gripped it." Dagon's lip twitched. That was as near to approval as such men usually came. "Precisely." The hololith sharpened. Gethsemane Tertius rotated above them. A shrine world turned in ghostly green lines and attack markers. Cathedral hives clustered around mountain ranges and dried inland seas. Each hive connected by processional roads, broad enough for pilgrim hosts, armor columns, and tithe convoys. Orbital defense rings encircled the world in staggered shells, not elegant, but deep. Starports clustered near the equatorial cathedra hives. Beneath one of those was marked in faint red, a sealed region of unknown depth. The Noctis Compass. Dagon's finger tapped the target rune. "This remains intact." Sev moved closer, helm tilted. "And the prisoners." Dagon turned to look at him. "Which prisoners?" "The first claim," Sev said. "The officer caste, priests, vox overseers, anyone whose screaming might still be useful before death." Dagon's expression did not change, but something in the room cooled. "Priority captives are to be transferred for interrogation, access extraction, route codes, cathedral sub-level maps, and tithe vault entries. You may butcher what remains after utility is exhausted." "You presume much," Sev said. "I command the surface assault," Dagon answered. "That is not the same as command of us." At last, Karen turned from the hololith. His bare face, pale and scar-lined in the crimson wash of the strategium, showed nothing but a tired malice sharpened into focus. "My claw will not be leashed by battlefield bookkeeping." "Your claw," Dagon said, "is receiving shells, fuel, gene stock, and medici support from my master, while your ship still smells like near starvation. Spare me the theatrics of offended nobility. You will descend where ordered, kill what needs killing, and surrender any living asset judged of tactical worth." Sev's gauntlet drifted toward the hilt of his blade. Karen raised one hand without looking at him. The gesture was minute. It froze Sev in place more effectively than a shouted command would have done. "We will not cripple the objective through indulgence," Karen said. "But I decide what constitutes useful fear on the ground." Dagon held his gaze for several heartbeats. The clash between them was not merely over prisoners, it was over doctrine. The Red Corsair Creed measured pain by yield. The 8th Legion had long ago learned that terror itself could be a weapon of such purity, it made strategy look timid. Yet even Karen understood that starving men did not refuse loaded magazines for the sake of pride. Dagon gave the smallest nod. "Kill with restraint only where it serves the objective. Priests and command staff of the lower catacomb districts come to me alive if possible. If not, their heads intact. There are rites and codes below the hive that may yet open for familiar tongues." Sev voxed a private curse of such venomous creativity that even Varyast gave a short laugh. The mustering continued around them. Across adjoining dock decks and launch bays, the assault echelons were assembled in ranks that stretched from one docking spine to the next. Traitor guardsmen in mixed fatigues and salvaged flak harness were herded toward assault carriers under the muzzles of enforcer teams. They came from a dozen dead regiments and forgotten rebellions, their uniforms mismatched, their faces hollow with the particular fatalism of men who knew they were never intended to survive planetfall and yet still checked their bayonets by rote. Mutant thralls lumbered behind them on shock chains, some broad as cargo loaders, others bent and malformed, their flesh swollen into asymmetries no sane gene right would ever sanction. Some had iron cages riveted over their heads to stop them gnawing at their own handlers. Chained shock beasts were hauled snorting from beast haulers by teams of electro-prod thralls, creatures of vat-bred rage and stitched muscle, all jaw, horn, claw, and chem-burned hate. They bucked against restraint, smashing deck plating under their hooves and talons, eyes blazing with pain filter stimulants. Every useful thing went to war under Huron, whether it wore armor, rags, fur, or old scars. Karen left the Strategium to walk the lower Medicae decks with Morval before the launch order. The apothecary had requested privacy, which among Night Lords usually meant he had found something too interesting to trust to Vox. They descended through 2 sealed blast hatches into a disused munitions tier now turned over to surgical work. The air stank of preservatives, antiseptic unguents, hot blood, and the sweet chemical tang of gene fluid. Red Corsair dead lay in opened rows upon iron tables. Their progenoid extraction wounds shone wet under lumen globes. Preservation jars lined the walls. A servitor was scraping marrow slurry from a shattered femur into a collection trough. Morval held up a canister between steel fingers. Inside, the harvested organ floated in cloudy suspension threaded with black veins. "Look closely," he said. Karen did. The progenoid should have been cleanly pale beneath the fluid, like an unborn thing dreaming in narcotic sleep. Instead, it was marred by fine discolorations, dark capillary strands spreading through the tissue in root-like patterns. Not rot in the mortal sense, something subtler, a corruption of the seed itself. "Warp contamination," Karen said. "Not raw enough for that. Not yet." Morval set the canister back into its cradle and moved to the next. Stress degeneration, mutation pressure, a lineage cooked too long in stormlight and battlefield stimulants. The Maelstrom has not merely sheltered them, it has entered the stock. He moved down the line, checking another, then another, all with the same creeping shadow in the tissue. "The Red Corsairs can still harvest from the dead," Morval continued, "but not forever. This is a slow betrayal. A rot bought the day Huron fled into the storm and mistook refuge for kingship. Their seed is learning the price of the bargain." Karen looked down the rows of opened dead. "Does Garyon know?" Morval's lenses gleamed. "Garyon is not a fool. That is what makes him interesting. He knows, and he hides the depth of it. He can cut away symptoms, reject the worst lines, stabilize the present. But this," he tapped the canister, "this is dynasty sickness, the kind that builds empires in the first generation and monsters in the next." Karen thought of Huron on his throne, encased in iron and will. Thought of a kingdom built from wrecks, plunder, and necessity. Thought of what such a kingdom would become if its bloodline of war was already going sour. He never heard the first whisper. He felt it, a tightening at the back of the skull, a pressure behind the eyes. The deck beneath him seemed to tilt, though the grav plates remained steady. He took one step backward and struck the edge of a surgical table. The lumen globes overhead smeared into starfire. Morval's hand snapped out, not to comfort, but to hold him upright for observation. Karen's vision tore open. He stood within a cathedral vast enough to shame a hive spire. Bells swung overhead from chains of flayed gold. Prayer banners burned in still air. Pilgrims screamed and trampled one another beneath a rain of dust. Then the floor split, not from bombardment above, from beneath. The nave burst upward in a thunder of black stone and bone-white masonry as something under the cathedral drove through centuries of sanctity like a blade through paper. Columns snapped, altars overturned, a whole choir pit collapsed into red dark. Above, the sky was thick with fire. Ships rained from orbit like cast spears, their blazing hulls carving incandescent wounds across the heavens before crashing into towers and processional roads. Amid the ruin, in the heart of the opening earth, he saw the thing calling to him again. A compass, not a navigator's instrument, not a machine in any sane meaning of the word. A vast astromantic engine built from screaming brass arcs, blackened cabling, Saint bones riveted into housings, lenses made from polished eye clusters, and needles of witchlight turning in impossible geometries. Every movement of its limbs drew blood from the air. Every degree it shifted made the shadows point in different directions. Then it turned toward him as if it possessed a face. Karen came back with a sound torn from somewhere old and animal. He was on one knee, blood running fresh from his nose. A servo skull nearby had shattered against the deck from the force of his collapse. Morval crouched over him. Again. The cathedral breaks from below, Karen said, breath ragged through bared teeth. Ships fall burning through the sky. The compass is not dormant, it is waiting. A slow clap came from the hatchway. Garland Solita stood there, his robe-edged armor whispering against the doorframe, eyes bright with measured amusement. He had entered, without either of them noticing, which was insult enough. That he had lingered to watch was worse. You describe it almost lovingly, the sorcerer said. Karen rose, wiping blood from his mouth. You move like a thief for a man so eager to be seen. Garland stepped inside the medici chamber, nodding once to the dead lined on tables, as if acknowledging colleagues at labor. A thief steals what is unwatched. I collect what men advertise with every tremor in their face. Morval turned away with clear irritation and resumed sealing canisters, leaving the exchange to ripen. Garland came closer, his gaze lingering on the corrupted progenoids for only an instant, before returning to Karen. You should be careful with your certainty. I have none. That is why you may live longer than most seers. Garland's smile thinned. Listen well, Night Lord. In the Maelstrom, the future is not observed from afar, like stars through a lens. It has teeth. It scents attention. It notices when men like you peer into it. The future here is not seen. He leaned closer. It bites. Karen held the sorcerer's stare, then let it choke. Garland laughed softly, the sound almost warm and therefore vile. Defiance is healthiest before contact. He turned and drifted back toward the hatch. Be ready. The Imperial Augur Bastions have finally noticed what assembles in their dark. As if on cue, the ship vox chimed with a command-level priority rune. Karen followed Garland back up to the Strategium, where the hololith now showed not only the mustering fleet, but bursts of encoded transmissions, lancing outward from the Edgewood reaches. Imperial signal traffic, distress pleas, route warnings, fragmentary requests for reinforcement. On a side display, one of Huron's signal adepts had isolated and translated a burst from an auger station beyond the storm fringe. The words rolled across the screen in cold green text. Mass contact event. Multiple hostile signatures emerging from Maelstrom anchor lanes. Strength indeterminate. Repeat, strength indeterminate. By the throne, it is a fleet. All stations forward warning to Gethsemane Tertius. Request immediate naval support. Request Astartes support. Request anyone. Dagon read it once and bared his teeth. Too late. Across the anchorage, klaxons began to sound. Not alarms, summons. Launch towers opened their armored petals. Dock clamps withdrew. Attack craft flooded from carrier bays in sheets so dense they resembled schools of metallic fish vomited into vacuum. Invasion hulls dropped from cradle mounts and ignited drives, their engines staining the dark with furnace light. Boarding torpedoes were swung onto magnetic rails and fed into launch tubes in chained ranks. Assault barges lumbered outward, flanked by escort raiders and gun cutters. Tens of thousands of small craft poured from the fortress and its attendant warships, a plague of steel and murder rushing, into the storm lanes with predatory cohesion. The Widow's Gospel shuddered as her own engines rose to war output. Ammunition conveyors screamed in the holds. Surf crews chanted loading rites at a manic pace. The chosen claw sealed their helms and took their places for descent. Around them, every deck of the strike cruiser seemed to tighten like a muscle before the blow. The fleet moved, not in one line, not in noble parade, but in layered waves of function. Raiders first, lean and swift, angling ahead to cut pickets and blind the routes in. Carrier screens followed. Main strike hulls advanced behind them under a wash of jamming static and storm interference. Slave transports and munitions lighters came under heavy guard. Scrap-built gun platforms were dragged into flanking positions, their chained bulk turning slowly as batteries charged. The whole host entered the breathing dark of the Maelstrom like a knife thrust deeper into infected flesh. Hours later, when the storm had spat them from one screaming lane into a clearer reach of void, Gethsemane Tertius appeared. It hung in the forward display, immense and serene at first glance, a shrine world swaddled in cloud bands and the pale gleam of moonlit oceans. Then, the details resolved. Defense platforms girdled the world in layered belts bristling with guns. Orbital shrines and traffic stations clustered thick as barnacles around the primary approach lanes. Pilgrim flotillas clogged the high anchor orbits, liners, shrine barges, merchant caravels and supply ships drifting in regulated procession, so numerous that they almost formed a second ring around the planet. Their running lights winked in innocent patterns. Their holds were full of the faithful, the desperate, the sick, the penitent, and the doomed. They had nowhere to run. Sev stood at Karen's side before the viewing bay, helm lenses fixed on the world below. "Beautiful," he said. Karen watched the defense stations turning to meet the oncoming dark and thought of the cathedral splitting open from beneath, of the sky raining ships, of brass and bone screaming in the deep. "No," he said quietly, "only unwarned." War began above Gethsemane Tertius as a geometry of murder. The first shots were not heroic. They were calculations. Red Corsair spearcraft darted ahead of the main host in dispersed wedges, drives hot, auger masks burning false returns into the defense lattice, while behind them, the heavier guns of Huron's fleet opened in staggered sequence. Lances stabbed across the void. Macro shells crossed the darkness like newborn suns wrapped in metal. The nearest orbital monitor took the first full broadside amidships, its armor belts holding for the space of a breath before the second impact cracked it open from engine spine to command blister. The vessel died without grace. Its hull folded inward, then outward, vomiting atmosphere, ammunition, and men in glittering swarms. A third shell found the ruptured core and transformed what remained into a white-orange blossom that flared bright enough for the shrine barges beneath it to cast shadows across the world below. Then the system came fully awake, and the void turned rabid. Defense platforms girdling the world began to fire in depth. Layered rings of macro cannon, torpedo silos and laser arrays hurling everything they possessed into the oncoming dark. Navy picket frigates broke anchor in frantic disorder, some trying to form lines, others turning at once to shield the most crowded civilian lanes. Pilgrim traffic, vast and fat with the faithful, panicked almost immediately. Shrine hulks tried to burn hard for the planet, for translation routes, for anywhere not painted by target runes. But the lanes were too crowded, and the warning came too late. Pilgrim liners collided bow to flank and spun helplessly. Merchant caravels vomited lifeboats before the first enemy rounds even reached them. Vox traffic shrieked across every frequency, prayers, collision alarms, command overrides, and pleas for mercy, layering into a single unbroken scream of machine-distorted despair. Dagon Varkas watched it from the assault bridge of the blood requital and smiled without joy. "Drive the civilian mass into the defense cone," he ordered. No one aboard his command deck needed the instruction repeated. Corsair raiders detached from his flanks and slashed across the pilgrim lanes, not to destroy at first, but to herd. Boarding torpedoes detonated among the largest shrine hulks. not penetrating but crippling guidance arrays, killing bridge crews and leaving the giant vessels drifting broadside across the likely lines of defensive fire. Panic finished the work. A cathedral barge, its outer hull plated in gold-chased iconography and packed with tens of thousands of chanting pilgrims, turned directly into the path of a defensive monitor's barrage. 3 shells cored its stem to stern. The barge came apart in incandescent chunks, and those fragments struck 2 lesser vessels beside it, transforming all 3 into a drifting continent of fire and sacred wreckage. "Again," Dagon said. His raiders acknowledged in clipped bursts, their voices precise, their kills as disciplined as accounting. This was what set them apart from most of the feral carrion in the Eye and Stormwood deeps. They did not kill to admire the shape of terror. They killed to open corridors, to blind stations, to force enemy commanders into predictable errors. Starports, macro batteries, transit nodes, defense relays, docking towers, cargo lifts, void shield projectors, command cloisters. Every target had a place in the chain of conquest. Every volley served an advance. Across the attack net, Karen Vale listened in contempt and understanding. The Widow's Gospel came in beneath the kill shadow of a dying pilgrim hulk, whose vast chapel-studded mass had already been flensed open by fire. Bodies and icons tumbled from its rent, decks in glittering streams. The strike cruiser's remaining guns hammered once, twice, thrice, smashing a path toward an orbital bastion whose exterior batteries were still tracking Dagon's spearcraft. Boarding clamps deployed, torpedoes spat, maglock alarms screamed through the hull. "First claw with me," Karen said. Sev Drask laughed over the squad channel. At last. The bastion was an iron cathedral built to kill from afar. Its corridors had never expected murder to arrive from within. The Night Lords entered through ruptured maintenance arteries and service locks punched open by melter torches, their armor blackening under atmosphere bleed and emergency lumen collapse. They moved in total darkness by helm rune, motion ping, and the wet animal sounds of frightened mortals trying too hard not to breathe. Karen led without hurry. He knew this kind of fighting better than he knew prayer. A warship or a void bastion in Blackout was not merely a battlefield to sons of Nostramo. It was home. The first defenders died without firing. Armsmen in void harness turned at the sound of boots and had their throats opened by chain blades before they could raise alarm. A command adept stumbled from a side chapel and Sev tore his jaw off with one backhanded strike, then pressed the spasming body against a lumen shrine until it shorted in a fountain of sparks and burning fat. Varjas jammed a breaching charge against a sealed blast hatch, counted the beat with his gauntlet against the wall, and stepped through the fireball while brass fragments and human teeth were still spinning in the air. They reached the command deck in less than 7 minutes. Inside, officers were still shouting range corrections to batteries already blind and dying. A priest of the fleet was on his knees before the command pulpit, one hand on a cracked relic casket, the other pressed to his vox bead as he roared invocations against the heretic. The lights failed just as he looked, just up. The Night Lords came out of the dark like an old punishment. Karen cut the presiding officer in half from collarbone to hip. Sev vaulted the tactical lectern and drove his chain blade through a ratings officer's face, upward into the cranial vault, revving until the man's skull burst in a steaming fan across the station chart. Varjast hacked both arms from a Vox lieutenant and left him shrieking on the deck long enough for the screams to become useful. One of the command crew reached for the emergency beacon, and Morval pinned him to the wall with his Narthesium arm, injector talons punching through ribs and flooding the body with combat stim, until the man convulsed so violently his spine snapped. Karen took the bridge Vox alive. "Patch every surviving channel," he ordered. A bleeding astropath thrall dragged from the bastion's sanctum was forced against the relay throne, while Sev flayed strips from the still-living Vox lieutenant and wrapped them around the shrine microphone in glistening ribbons. Then the Night Lords began the true work. They did not merely kill the surviving officers, they made them audible. Across the defense grid, on every linked station and monitor that still possessed a functioning receiver, The command net filled with the torn throat screams of officers being opened alive in the dark. Orders became pleas. Battery coordinates dissolved into wet, choking sobs and chain blade revs. One bastion commander managed a final, defiant prayer to the Emperor before Huron tore his tongue free and forced it against the broadcast grill so that the sound cut off in a gurgling whine. Another officer was skinned from scalp to sternum, while Sev recited the monitor's own casualty runes back at him in a mockery of bureaucratic devotion. Whole defense sections fell silent thereafter, not because all their operators were dead, but because some could no longer force their hands to touch the Vox controls. Far below, Gethsemane, Tertius watched the sky catch fire. Billions lived beneath those hives and shrine domes. Billions saw the heavens stained red by burning wreckage and descending war. Orbital stations split apart and fell in rivers of incandescent debris. Escape craft and drop hulls streaked through the upper atmosphere like swarms of spiteful stars. Pilgrim traffic burned in sheets, whole chapel decks tumbling down as luminous cinders. Night on the world's face became the colour of fresh blood under a surgeon's lamp. Across hab blocks, processional roads and cathedral plazas, the faithful fell to their knees in numbers beyond counting, some praying, some screaming, some staring upward in the dumb paralysis of those who have just learned how small their God's protection truly is. Marshal Enoch Van stood within the primary command vault of the Upper Hive Citadel and watched the first stations die across the tactical hololith. He was a broad man gone lean with age and attrition, his face all scar tissue, old burns, and hard lines cut by duty rather than nobility. He wore the dress cuirass of a planetary marshal over void grey fatigues, not out of vanity, but because the breastplate had belonged to his father, and his father had bled in it during the hive food riots 20 years before. A power saber hung at one hip. His cap lay discarded on the plotting table beside stacks of casualty printouts already growing obsolete. Around him, Vox officers, chart adepts, and PDF lieutenants fought to preserve coherence while the defense net tore apart by the minute. A junior officer, no more than a boy with one cheek still marked by the strap scar of his rebreather, turned from the Vox dais, pale and shaking. Lord Marshal, Bastion Hieronym is gone. Bastion Vesper is not answering. Starport Command reports unidentified penetrations in the outer docks. Civilian traffic has lost all traffic discipline. Then stop calling it civilian traffic, Van said. His voice was low and exhausted and utterly free of panic. Call it blockage. Call it debris. Call it dead if it calms you. It changes nothing. He stabbed a gloved finger at the hive map. Recall what void assets remain to layered defense around the principal descent vectors. Seal the tithe vaults now. Triple locks. Ecclesiarchy codes and command seals both. If any priest objects, shoot him and inform his superior that he died in a state of useful service. The young officer hesitated. And the lower districts, sir. Van's eyes did not leave the display. Purge the catacomb approaches. A second officer looked up sharply. All of them. All of them. At last Van turned, and the command vault seemed to shrink around the force of his certainty. Prometheum flush where possible, melter collapse where not. Vent poison into the lesser tunnels. I want the lower sancta and the old mortuary galleries made impassable. No one enters beneath the shrine hive. No one leaves. Not priests. Not pilgrims. Not our own. The hesitation this time carried fear rather than confusion. It confirmed what many in the room already suspected. Something below the hive mattered more than the millions still packed into the districts above. One of the senior logisticians swallowed. My lord, there are refugee columns moving down there already. Tens of thousands. Then they die in the Emperor's shadow, Van said. Do you imagine those things coming out of the dark will be gentler? He turned back to the hololith. Deploy every remaining core regiment to the Cathedral District, transit spines and macro battery precincts, pilgrim levies to interior barricades, Hab militias to void shelter enforcement and anti-riot cordons. Any man not holding a rifle can carry shells. Any man not carrying shells can drag wounded. Any man unwilling to obey can be hanged where the next crowd will see it. There it was. No speech, no theatre, only the blunt doctrine of an imperial commander who knew the scale of what was descending and had elected to become stone rather than man. Above him, Huron Blackheart remained far from the first blood. He watched from the apex of the assault host aboard his throne deck command vessel, not idling, not detached, but directing the battle with the same calm attention a tithemaster might devote to balancing ledgers. One gauntleted finger moved across hololithic attack paths, while casualty streams crawled in pale green down the air around him. Ships lost, guns silenced, cargo opportunities created, boarding vectors exploited, civilian mass displacement, orbital shield attrition. He did not waste himself in the first wave because the first wave was expenditure. He was not a berserker king seeking personal glory in the opening exchange. He was a pirate emperor counting debt, profit, and blood. And from his throne, every burning station and shattered pilgrim barge was another entry settled in full. Starport crown of, "The western approach is weakening," Dagon voxed from within the fight. "I want the second wave pushed now." Huron did not raise his voice. "Take it then. Leave the transit spines structurally viable. I will not have fools collapsing what we mean to use." Red Corsair assault doctrine unfolded across the world with merciless clarity. Raiders and boarding cadres smashed starport control hubs before the defenders could fully seal them. Macro battery precincts were hit by simultaneous breaches in their ammunition lifts and upper command galleries, turning local discipline into chaos within minutes. Transit nodes, mag rail interchanges and cargo elevators were seized rather than obliterated because movement was worth more than spectacle. They cut the world's arteries and immediately began pumping their own strength through them. The Night Lords, given partial freedom in the lower thrust lanes, converted conquest into contagion. Karen did not waste his brothers on ordinary line fighting where mortal auxiliaries could die just as usefully. He sent them where fear would ripple outward faster than shell fragmentation. Vox masts became gallows. Hab overseers were skinned and hung upside down over evacuation routes so that panicked crowds had to force their way through a rain of steaming blood to flee. District commandants were nailed alive to shrine doors with their own badges hammered through their cheeks. Whole platoons of pilgrim levies broke at the sight of one flayed officer suspended above a transit bridge, with his eyes wired open and his screams amplified through public sermon speakers. Sev reveled in it, though never without purpose. He butchered a barricade line of Hab militia in one district, then left the limbs arranged into directional markers pointing away from the true Night Lord advance and toward a kill zone already seeded with mines and hidden firing angles. When PDF armor tried to redeploy through the confusion, they drove directly into the trap and died locked inside their own vehicles as melter bursts turned troop holds into pressure cookers. Karen watched the wider collapse spread through tactical overlays and at last understood something essential about Dagon Varkas. The Red Corsair captain did not despise the 8th Legion because they were cruel. Every warband in Huron's empire was cruel. Cruelty was coin. No, Dagon despised them because their methods could not be cleanly monetized. Terror broke populations magnificently, but it also spoiled inventories, disrupted labor chains, ignited riots that consumed useful infrastructure, and left too many corpses in places where one might prefer captives, loaders, hostages, or tribute stock. The Night Lords made victories collapse inward under the weight of their own fear. Red Corsairs preferred victory to remain upright long enough to be robbed properly. Over the command net, their friction sharpened. "You have 3 transit sectors in full panic," Dagon snapped as fresh runes flashed across the tactical display. "I needed those roads open for armor descent." "You have them empty," Karen replied. "I have them burning." Fire moves the slow faster than command whistles ever did. Dagon's answer was a short silence laden with murder. "One day, Prophet, I will choose efficiency over politics and vent you from an airlock." Sev cut in before Karen could answer. Do that, and I will come back through the hull just to embarrass your corpse. Varjast laughed over the private channel. Karen muted them both and turned his attention groundward. The main hive loomed beneath the storm of descent, a mountain of sanctity and habitation packed so densely that entire cities lived within the ribs of its lower levels. Its spires were banded with defensive emplacements, shrine alcoves, statue galleries, and habstacks piled atop one another in impossible vertical congestion. Around its base, processional roads and cathedral plazas churned with civilian flight. Above it, the sky swarmed. Drop assaults were coming in now by the thousand. Assault barges, invasion landers, torpedo capsules, and heavy drop coffins tore through the atmosphere in sheets, their wakes turning the clouds into smeared wounds of fire. Defense fire reached up to meet them. Some descent craft burst apart. Some slewed trailing flame and dead crew. Some drove on regardless, carrying whatever remained alive toward impact. Then, the first orbital plate fell. It had been part of a shattered defense bastion, a broken section of armored superstructure kilometers wide, still trailing fires from the void battle above. It entered the atmosphere as a red mountain, tumbling, shearing apart, its undersides glowing white as the world itself tried to reject the wound. Everyone on the main hive's upper tiers could see it coming. Sirens screamed, pilgrims pointed upward, priests raised relics and shouted prayers no one could hear over the sonic thunder. The plate struck the outer districts with the force of local extinction. Spire crowns vanished in a bloom of masonry, steel, glass, and pulverized bone. Shock waves punched through habstacks and chapel rows for kilometers in every direction. Transit bridges snapped. Whole districts folded. The light of the impact turned stained glass windows into molten cataracts pouring down the sides of towers. And through that rising wall of ruin and debris, through the ringing concussion and the impossible rain of falling stone, the next wave of traitor descent craft came hammering down toward the hive like nails driven into a coffin lid. The first harvest had only just begun. The main hive burned like a sermon spoken by a mad god. Its upper spires still stood in places, clawing at a sky gone the color of clotted arterial spray. But below them, the body of the city was coming apart under the weight of war. Cathedra fronts collapsed in showers of statues and stained glass. Processional roads built to bear centuries of pilgrim feet were now clogged with armored columns, unable to advance, reverse, or turn, as panicked masses broke around them like surf around wreckage. Habstacks burned from basement sump chambers to needle spires, their interiors becoming vertical crematoria where families hammered at sealed exits until smoke and heat took the strength from their bones. Shrine bells rang without pattern as fire climbed their towers and melted the hands of the dead who had spent lifetimes winding them. The streets were no longer streets. They were rivers of meat. Pilgrims in ash-white robes stampeded in their hundreds of thousands across cathedral plazas and market levels slick with blood and lamp oil. Broken carts, dropped reliquaries, overturned ration haulers, and trampled children disappeared beneath the press of bodies. Somewhere in the smoke, ecclesiarchy loudhailers still droned litanies of fortitude, but their speakers had begun to distort, each prayer turning into a metallic howl before the last line. Armor columns of the Planetary Defense Force were trapped nose to tail along the processional avenues, turret crews screaming for clearance while civilians swarmed over their hulls, begging for sanctuary, until the tanks surged forward and crushed them flat in wet smears beneath their tracks. The dead were already layering the roads. The living ran over them until they stopped looking down. From the upper transit bastion of a looted mag-rail exchange, Dagon Varkas watched the hive choke. He had driven hard from the first breach points, cutting the world not where it screamed loudest, but where it would bleed slowest. Starport crowns were his. 2 major macro battery precincts had already fallen under Red Corsair control, their gun crews dead or chained to their own loading servitors. The next objective lay inward, beneath the cathedral district and the transit spine that fed men, cargo and pilgrims into the shrine hives. Lower reaches. Below those roads, lower still beneath centuries of burial crypts and prayer vaults, the paths descended toward the sealed sancta that hid the Noctis compass. Everything else on the planet was noise until that ingress was secured. A tactical image shimmered before him, cast from a portable hololithic brassard attached to his vambrace. Root runes crawled over the cathedral district in green, amber, and murder red. He opened the command channel. All Reaver Claws, tighten the noose around the transit spine. I want cargo lifts, pilgrim tunnels, and maintenance shafts under lock before the next hour mark. No uncontrolled demolition in the cathedral district. No structural kills unless the route is already useless. Prisoners with sub-level access codes come up the chain alive. A chorus of acknowledgements answered him. Crisp, efficient, not one wasted syllable. Then another voice cut across the command net, low, flat, and amused. You order the city as though it loves obedience. Karen Vale. Dagon did not look away from the burning avenues below. I order it because I do not mistake panic for victory. His helm auto-senses isolated movement several levels down where Night Lords were already at work along the Hab terraces. Bodies hung from signal masts. Fires spread through districts that had no tactical value besides the terror they inspired in those who could see them from elsewhere. You should, Karen said. Panic clears lines, ruptures command, and blinds discipline. You are trying to grasp the hive by its bones while it still has nerves. We are helping you strip them. You are salting assets. Assets? Karen almost laughed. That is why you resent us, Reaver. It is not the cruelty, it is the waste. Dagon cut the channel before he gave himself the pleasure of threatening him again. Threats were useful only when one had time to collect on them. For now, he had roads to lock, vaults to claim, and a city to keep from destroying itself too early. He strode from the transit bastion into the teeth of the battle. Around him, red Corsair raiders moved with savage restraint, lean killers in crimson-black plate taking stairwells, gantries, and mag-rail platforms by sections. They did not linger over the dead. They did not cut simply because there was flesh at hand. They breached, cleared, marked, advanced. A PDF-heavy stubber nest was flanked and annihilated in less than a minute because it covered a cargo interchange. A shrine guard barricade was left burning in place, not because it was dramatic, but because the fire channeled fleeing civilians away from the routes the Corsairs needed open. Every death paid toward movement. At the base of the transit spine, a line of pilgrim levies broke from cover and ran shrieking with devotional axes and las carbines raised high. Raiders dropped to one knee as a single organism and fired in disciplined bursts. The front rank vanished into sprays of ribs, robecloth, and steaming organs. Survivors stumbled over the disintegrating bodies and were finished with pistol shots to the face. Dagon stepped through the collapse of them without slowing. One of the dying tried to clutch at his greave and bless him with a mouthful of blood. Dagon crushed the man's skull under his heel and kept issuing orders. Elsewhere, deeper down where the hive's lower districts narrowed into reliquary quarters and stacked ossuary streets, Karen Vale began his own war. He had no interest in Dagon's careful accounting. The underhive districts beneath the grand cathedral routes were already too dense, too frightened and too choked with fleeing humanity for neat exploitation. Here, panic was not a problem to be managed. It was a weapon waiting to be sharpened. Drive them inward, Karen told Sev Drask as they moved through a smoke-filled reliquary avenue where hundreds of side chapels lined both walls. Break the routes behind them, make the crowds do the killing for us. Sev's helm turned, lenses gleaming in the red light of spreading fire. And the dead. Cover, Karen said. Confusion. Barricade material. Instruction. Varjast voxed a rough chuckle. You always did speak of slaughter like an engineer. Karen looked up the avenue. Above, on balconies carved with martyr saints, civilians huddled in clusters around shuttered shrine doors while below them, the street convulsed with stampeding bodies and the impacts of stray ordnance. We learned long ago that fear is labor. Let it work. Sev took the reliquary quarter as if it had been promised to him in childhood. His claw hit the first chapel line by breaching through the side walls rather than the doors, chain blades chewing through sanctified masonry and the hidden maintenance ducts behind it. The defenders inside, shrine wardens and volunteer militia with ceremonial breastplates strapped over cheap flak, never had time to form a firing line. Sev tore through them in a storm of revving teeth and pulverized bone, kicking one man's knee backward through his own thigh before ripping his face off and hurling it into the congregation behind him. His brothers moved with the same cold appetite. Bolter fire blew holes through devotional frescoes, and the men kneeling beneath them. Brass shell casings rolled among candles and severed fingers. One of the surviving shrine wardens, blood bubbling from the hole where his collarbone had been, collapsed before Sev with his palms pressed together. "Mercy!" the warden gasped. "By the throne, mercy!" Sev caught him by the throat and lifted him off the floor one-handed. The chain blade in his other fist dripped pink foam and shreds of spinal cord. "Listen carefully," Sev said, his voice flattening through the helm grill until it sounded like a Vox lecture delivered in a torture vault. "Mercy is not what this is for. Fear is. Pain is. Collapse is. You imagine cruelty is rage with a blade in its hand. That is because you are prey, and prey romanticizes the mouth that takes it." He squeezed until cartilage popped in the man's neck. "Cruelty is doctrine. We are not here because we hate you. We are here because your kind runs faster when you understand what waits, if you do not." He hurled the choking warden through the front shrine doors into the avenue outside. The man landed amid the flood of pilgrims, convulsing, and the crowd split around him in a wave of fresh screams. "Hang the officers," Sev ordered. "Blind the loud-hailers with flayed skins. Leave the children alive long enough to run." No one in his claw asked why. They knew. The children would carry the truth ahead of them better than any Vox burst. Within the hour, the entire reliquary quarter had become a corridor of spectacle. Priests were suspended from statue pedestals by their own rosaries, with their bellies opened so their entrails hung in devotional loops. Militia captains were nailed to traffic pylons, skinned from scalp to heel, and made to watch the avenue below through their own peeled eyelids. Vox masts bore new banners stitched from human hide. Panic rippled outward faster than any shelling could have forced it. The Imperium answered as it always answered when cornered. Not with grace, with stubbornness sharpened into martyrdom. Marshal Enoch Van had been urged to withdraw twice, and ignored both requests with increasing contempt. He remained in the command redoubt beneath the upper hive citadel until the outer galleries were struck by falling debris from the Void War and the blast threw dust across the hololithic map. Only then did he descend to the forward command line, not to flee, but to shorten the distance between his orders and the men dying under them. He stood now at a barricade built across the grand ossuary approach, a broad avenue where shrine processions had once marched beneath colonnades of St. Bones and incense. Braziers. The braziers had been overturned into fire trenches. Corpses jammed the gutters knee-deep. Behind the barricade, exhausted PDF infantry, Hab militia dragooned into line service, and the remnants of 3 disciplined corps regiments reloaded from ammunition piles stacked beside devotional statuary. Their faces were grey with fatigue and ash. Many had not removed their rebreathers for hours. Pilgrim levies crowded behind them, clutching looted rifles and sharpened ceremonial tools. The smell was of blood, cordite, promethium, and opened bowel. A colonel with one arm in a sling leaned close enough to be heard over the bombardment. "My lord, evacuation routes from the lower wards are gone. The catacomb purge teams report civilian numbers too great to clear." "Then let the charges do what prayer cannot," Van said. The colonel looked as if he wished to object on behalf of decency, habit, or his own soul. He did none of those things. He saluted. Van drew his power saber, and pointed it down the corpse-choked avenue where smoke shifted with unnatural restlessness. Counterattack when they commit, not before. Let the bastards come to the dead and choke on them. Armor will push the center. Pilgrim levies hold the flanks with mine satchels and faith. If a man breaks, shoot him. If a line breaks, build another from bodies. One of the militia officers, a thick-necked hab foreman, still wearing his worker's Auspex harness over flak, stared at the marshal with hollow disbelief. You want us to charge through that? Van did not even glance at him. I want you to die where your death delays them. Everything else is comfort. The foreman went pale. Then he nodded because there was nothing else left to be. Far beneath them, in the lower catacombs below the cathedral district, Morval moved through the aftermath of the first underground breaches, with clinical delight so cold it bordered on contempt. The catacombs had not been built in a single age. That much was already obvious. Layers of imperial crypt masonry, reliquary galleries and mortuary lifts gave way the deeper one went, their devotional architecture becoming older, cruder, then abruptly more precise. Here and there beneath collapsed vaults and burst burial chambers, machine walls showed through. Not Adeptus Mechanicus construction, not any pattern familiar from imperial manufactories or naval interfaces. Smooth black metal ribs, conduit channels without visible access hatches, logic housings shaped into impossible angles. This was no mere shrine crypt. Something far older had been buried, sanctified over and forgotten with exquisite determination. Morval barely spared it a glance at first. The dead interested him more. He knelt beside a fallen red corsair whose chest had been opened by mass reactive fragmentation and whose progenoid harvest mark had not yet been taken. Around him lay loyalist stormtroopers, shrine guard, mutant thralls and pilgrims alike, all mixed into one slurry of torn limbs and powdered masonry. His servo arms descended with delicate precision, extracting tissue samples, scraping marrow, cutting into organs, preserving what remained salvageable. Look at them, he murmured over the private channel to Karen. Loyalists and renegades, the same stock cooked by different lies. This one's liver is a chem sponge. This one's bones are devotional malnutrition wrapped in duty. This one, he held up a sliver of corrupted progenoid between forceps, has begun to dream in the storm. Magnificent filth. Karen stepped over a mound of crushed civilians toward the newly exposed machine wall. You are sentimental today. I am disgusted, Morval replied. There is a distinction, the spiritual ruin I expect. It is the biological laziness that offends me. Look what faith does to mortals. Look what desperation does to our cousins in red. Everything decays, and no one has the decency to do so, elegantly. Karen pressed one gauntlet against the exposed wall. It was cold. Too cold for a structure buried beneath this much war, this much burning stone and churned earth. He felt a vibration through the metal, almost beneath sensation. Not movement, waiting. Before he could speak, the catacombs shook. Imperial defenders deeper in the lower sancta had reached the point where doctrine became burial. The sanctified demolition charges went up in sequence. Not one grand explosion, but a chain of consecrated collapse rolling through the undercrypts like the footfalls of an angry god. Vault ceilings dropped, support arches burst outward in halos of burning dust. Whole mortuary galleries folded into themselves, sealing passageways under mountains of stone. Bone caskets, reliquary iron and bodies. The blast wave hit Karen's strike element from the side and threw legionaries, corsairs and civilians alike into darkness. Dust became the world. He could not see, could not hear. Beyond the muffled thunder of continuing collapses and the wet impact of bodies crushed somewhere near at hand, warnings screamed in his helm. Auspex blanked. Static filled the squad net. Something large fell across his left pauldron and slid away, leaving a smear of hot blood. Then the pressure came behind his eyes again, and the dust cloud split open inside his mind. He saw a blade. Not a chainsword, not a legionary weapon. but a long, elegant killing edge of impossible refinement, silver blue in the dimness. It passed through red ceramite at the joint beneath a pauldron and emerged dark with transhuman blood. The warrior wearing that armor fell soundlessly, and around him shadows moved with predatory grace, alien to the ugly mass of human war. Then the vision changed. He stood in a chamber vast as a throne room and narrow as a grave. At its center sat a corpse crowned in iron, robed in torn grandeur, and enthroned upon cables that entered its flesh through spine, jaw, and ruined eye sockets. The body had once been regal. Now it was mummified majesty, skin leathered over bone, fingers fused around the arms of the throne while streams of green and red sigils crawled across the chamber walls, like nervous systems made visible. Above the corpse's head, a circlet of machine light turned slowly in the dark. Waiting, the thing seemed to say without words, waiting for kings and butchers alike. Karen tore back into himself as the dust settled enough for red emergency glow to return in ragged patches. He was half buried beneath broken stone and a dead pilgrim whose ribcage had collapsed inward like rotten wicker. Sev hauled him free with one hand and looked at the blood leaking from beneath Karen's nose seals. "You vanish into your skull at the most inconvenient times," Sev said. Karen shoved the corpse aside. "There are others coming." Imperials. Karen looked into the darkness beyond the collapse, where the exposed machine ribs vanished into deeper burial layers. Not only. Above ground, the war raged on with no knowledge of what slept below it. Marshal Van's counterattack had gone in across the Grand Oshery approach, driving armor and infantry through avenues so thick with dead that the tracks of his lead tanks left furrows of ground flesh behind them. The counterstroke briefly checked one Red Corsair advance and forced Dagon himself to redeploy 2 reserve claws to hold the transit spine. On the far side of the main hive, Sev's massacre in the Reliquary Quarter had panicked 3 entire civilian sectors into each other and crushed thousands to death without a single bolt round spent. Huron's fleet continued to feed men and metal into the wound from orbit. Then a new disturbance ghosted across the war zone. It began as auger static, unidentified returns, brief signatures too clean to be debris and too brief to be system noise. On the bridge of the Widow's Gospel, target locks flickered over empty space and vanished. Red Corsair signal adepts flagged unknown emissions moving at impossible vectors through the wreck fields in high anchor. One pirate escort on the outer screen transmitted a fragment of alarm, then dropped from the net. A second vanished, less than a minute later. No explosion, no debris bloom, just absence. Dagon's voice came sharp across the command channels. "Who is losing ships?" No answer came quickly enough. In the dust-thick dark beneath the cathedral, Karen turned his helm toward the ceiling, as if he could see the void through kilometers of stone and corpses. Somewhere up there, beyond the burning skies of Gethsemane Tertius, something new had entered the harvest. The first warning came as absence, not impact, not explosion, not the florid waste of a pirate dying loudly in the void. One of Huron's outer munitions cutters simply ceased to answer, its signal rune thinning to static and then to nothing, as if a careful hand had plucked it from the dark. Moments later, a second transport began to vent atmosphere in 3 clean silver-white plumes from amidships, so precise in their placement that the vessel's bridge remained intact long enough for its master to broadcast a half-formed distress cry before the drives failed and the ship drifted broadside across the wreck field. Then the knives came. They were visible only when they chose to be seen, elegant silhouettes sliding between the hulks of butchered pilgrim craft and burning defense wreckage. Slender warships with prows like drawn blades, hulls as smooth and cold as polished moonbone, sails of shimmering force curving from their flanks like the fins of deep predators. They did not announce themselves. They did not waste energy in broadside duels. They ghosted through the debris lanes and struck isolated pirate transports, ammunition lighters, and command relay craft with the contemptuous precision of surgeons removing rot. Lances of hard white light punched through engine, throats, cargo spines and bridge sanctums in exactly the places where the most harm could be done for the least expenditure of fire. A slave transport died first in full sight of the fleet. It had been turning under escort toward the descending assault lanes, its holds packed with chained reserves meant for the next surface wave, when a pair of those sleek Xenos raiders crossed its stern at impossible speed. The first sliced away its helm array. The second cut opened the lower prison decks with a beam so thin it might have been mistaken for a star's reflection until the entire side of the vessel peeled outward, and the trapped thousands within began vomiting into vacuum in a storm of flailing limbs, broken chains, and ice-blooming blood. By the time the escort ships swung their guns around, the attackers were already gone, swallowed back into the kill clutter of derelicts and flame. In the high command tiers of Huron's assault host, warning klaxons took on a new voice. Dagon. Varkas stood over the hololithic net aboard the blood requital and watched the outer lanes blink with fresh losses. "Mark all unidentified vectors," he snapped. "Rebuild the screen around the ammunition trains. I want relay redundancy now." A signal adept replied, with admirable calm, considering the circumstances. "Relays are being taken in sequence, Captain. They are cutting our sight lines apart." Dagon bared his teeth. That was the true danger, not the ships themselves, costly as each loss might prove, but the shape of the attack. This enemy was not trying to win the void above Gethsemane Tertius in one dramatic clash. It was severing nerves, vessels, and supply cords with aristocratic patience. Pirate fleets could survive carnage. They struggled when their profitable chaos was reduced to blindness. The hololith trembled. Another red rune died. This time, it was the munitions ship, Vengeful Tribute. The vessel had been heavy with macro shells, boarding torpedo, warheads, lacell pallets, and reserve promethium for the ground war. Dagon watched its signature stagger as multiple perfect strikes bit through magazine armor and cargo feed spines. Secondary detonations rippled along its length, not enough to destroy it all at once, merely enough to leave it crippled, venting fire and debris. Other ships nearest the wreck altered course at once to avoid the cloud of tumbling shells and unstable fuel canisters now contaminating the lane. Scarcity arrived like a blade laid across the throat. On the surface, the campaign had been fed by lavish expenditure until that moment. Ammunition, reserve hulls, expendable mortal waves and drop assets had flowed down in ugly abundance. Now every commander in Huron's chain felt the shift instantly. Every shell fired had a cost. Every resupply request would now compete with every other. Dagon understood the danger at once. A war of exact objectives could survive attrition. A war of wasted frenzy could not. Open the command net. All surface elements. Munition priority now restricted. No saturation fire without direct authorization. Auxiliary waves will carry what they can. Recover unexploded ordnance where feasible. We are not short yet, but we are now counting. From somewhere in the lower channels came Sev Drask's laughter. "You sound ill." Dagon keyed the source. "And you sound like a man I will eventually nail to a bulkhead." "Eventually," Sev said, "is a comforting word." The attackers did not relent. At the edge of the debris field above the Shrine World, a pirate relay frigate turned to reacquire the vanished signatures and found only the reflected glare of burning wreckage. Then a single bright spear struck through the frigate's bridge blister, passed out through the opposite side, and kept going into the dark. Crew, command altar, and Vox Shrine vanished in a spray of incandescent gore and crystal shards.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The dead ship rolled, collided with a scavenger hulk, and detonated what remained of its own communication banks. Across the fleet, messages began arriving in fragments, late, duplicated, or not at all. That was when Prince Iriel entered the war properly, though not in any way the Monkey would have called introduction. He stood upon the command dais of his own sleek vessel, as if the void itself had been bred for his convenience. His armor was elegant in the way execution can be elegant, every curve and line speaking not of brute resilience, but of speed, lineage, and lethal certainty. A spear of impossible artistry rested in his hand, held with casual familiarity rather than display. Around him, his corsairs moved in disciplined silence at their stations, each a polished instrument of chosen violence. No chains rattled in that command chamber. No slaves whimpered in the corners. No trophies dripped from the walls. There was only clean control, and a species-deep contempt sharp enough to shape tactics. He watched the pirate fleet through hollow projections and spirit sight overlays, reading its mass like a duelist reading breath and footing. Again, he said. His ships obeyed with exquisite cruelty. A pair of escorts feigned a high run toward one of Huron's larger gun platforms, drawing defensive augers and dry focus away from the lower lane, where a third corsair vessel ghosted through the shadow of a broken pilgrim cathedral. Its pulsefire struck the junctions of an ammunition lighter's cargo clamps in a sequence so mathematically exact that the container spine sheared apart without full sympathetic detonation. Hundreds of munitions pallets spilled into the void. Some ignited, some drifted. All became hazard. Nearby pirate craft scattered from their planned paths, and in that scattering 2 more command relays were gutted by long-range lance thrusts from unseen angles. Iriel watched the disruption spread and spoke as though discussing the pruning of diseased branches. They clutch at the storm as though the wound belongs to them. Let them starve, trying to hold what must not be held. One of his lieutenants inclined his head. The Mon-K have already gone to ground beneath the shrine hive. Shall we descend and take the mechanism? Iriel's gaze hardened by the smallest degree. Take? No. There are tools too dangerous to survive the hands that find them. The Noctis compass must be erased, not captured, not bargained over, not hidden again to tempt the next fool. He looked upon the distant world, its upper atmosphere scarred by burning descent trails. No Mon-K hand can be trusted stable paths through this wound. Give them certainty in the storm, and they will build empires of infection. There was no greed in him, no hunger to sit upon the thing or tax passage with it. His war was cleaner, and therefore in its own way more merciless. He was not there to loot. He was there to excise. Below, Gethsemane Tertius continued dying in layers. Karen Vale moved through the broken undercity beneath the cathedral district, while the battle above him became uncertain in a new way. Vox reports came jagged now, clipped or delayed. Supply requests were denied. Reserve descents were rerouted. The pressure of scarcity could be felt even here in the dark, where shell counts were recited with unusual care and fallen ammunition was stripped from the dead before the corpses cooled. The route his claw had taken through the collapsed catacombs now threaded along the exposed edges of the deeper machine complex, where burial vault masonry ended abruptly and impossible black metal began. The walls hummed at pitches that made mortal teeth crack. Geometric seams pulsed beneath dust and blood. At intervals, the floor seemed to lengthen or shorten by a fraction when not looked at directly, enough to make serfs stumble and old instincts whisper of warp tampering, though this was colder than warp work, more exact, less forgiving. A burst of lasfire cracked from a far gallery, and 3 traitor auxiliaries folded apart in sprays of blood. Karen turned at once, helm autosenses magnifying a distant colonnade half swallowed by dust. There, for one clean second between masonry pillars and drifting smoke, he saw movement unlike the crash and sprawl of human war, lean forms, low and swift, armor pale as moonlit bone, rifle flashes precise and almost beautiful in their economy, not close enough for certainty, close enough for instinct. Karen fired at once. His bolt rounds tore through a stone saint and exploded across the edge of a shattered archway. Something vanished from sight before the impacts landed. Return fire came in answer, not massed, not panicked, but a single line of shurikens slicing through the darkness. One of Karen's mortal pathfinders lost the side of his head in a red fan. A second took a monomolecular disc through the throat and collapsed clutching at a ruin of cartilage. "Xenos," Varjast voxed. Karen did not answer immediately. He was staring at the place where the shapes had been. There had been intention there, not merely attack, discipline, predation as a solved equation. Far above in the void, Iriel received a spirit mark report from one of his forward kill teams beneath the hive. Monkey transhumans, midnight armor, deliberate cruelty in their positioning. Old predators, he thought, reading the fragmentary impressions through his lieutenant's lenses. Not the red scavengers. Another breed of corpse ape, one that understood darkness as more than absence. For the barest instant, through proxies and long-range killing rather than sight, two hunters recognized kinship of a kind neither would ever admit. Not alliance, not respect. Only the cold acknowledgement that there existed in the opposite dark another creature shaped by doomed worlds, predation, and a private familiarity with ruin. Then the galleries shifted under fresh bombardment. Dust swallowed the angles, and the moment was gone. Back in the upper assault zones, Dagon's patience finally found a target close enough to satisfy it. He met Karen at a shattered transit exchange where cargo trams had been turned into barricades and the dead clogged the tracks in drifts. Red Corsair raiders were dragging ammunition cases from a wrecked lander, while Night Lords watched from gantries above like gargoyles carved from old homicide. "You drew them," Dagon said without preamble. Karen removed his helm, more insultingly calm, barefaced than he had ever seemed masked. "Your fleet is a beacon of plunder in a war zone. I assure you it required no invitation from us. These Xenos are cutting my supply spine apart while you play prophet in the dust. They are following the same lower paths your visions dragged you toward." Sev dropped from the gantry above and landed hard enough to crack stone. His chain blade was already in his hand, before either commander's escorts fully reacted. "Say that again," he said softly. Bolters rose, raiders spread, Night Lords along the gantries locked in firing stances. For one exquisite breath it seemed the entire campaign might curdle into immediate civil slaughter. Dagon did not step back. "I said your cursed seer has drawn trouble onto my objective." Sev came forward one pace, chainblade teeth whining. "And I say you can keep your objective, your shortages, and your flayed excuse for authority. But if you call our Lord cursed again, I will split your chest and let the hive hear how your organs sound hitting stone." Karen raised a hand. So did Dagon. The two gestures stopped the killing by inches. "Enough," Karen said. "Barely," Dagon replied. Before either could press further, every command channel in the sector flared with priority authority. Huron. His voice came through the static clotted network with absolute calm, and that calm had more weight than any shouted threat. "All commanders will continue the assault. Losses are acceptable. Delays are not. The objective beneath the shrine hive remains primary over shipping, districts, and personnel. If the Xenos wish to trim the outer harvest, let them. They will not alter the tithe. Press inward." Not one syllable was wasted mourning ships, crews, or whole districts already ground to sludge. It was plain in that moment that Huron valued the Noctis compass above men, munitions, and local victory alike. If he had to spend a fleet to buy the thing, he would count the price and pay it. Dagon exhaled once through his helm vents, all fury forced back into the harness of utility. "You heard him." Sev revved his chainblade a little harder before maglocking it to his thigh. Unfortunately. Nearby, in a shrine crypt commandeered for medici work, Gary and the Corpse Master turned necessity into butchery of a more organized kind. The crypt had once held the embalmed bones of local saints in tiered alcoves of gold and black. Marble. Now those alcoves overflowed with mutilated red corsairs, laid out for triage under harsh surgical lumens. Garion moved among them like a butcher priest at liturgy, mechadendrites descending in constant motion. One wounded raider had both legs removed at the hip because the tissue below was too far gone to justify reactor drain on repair. Another had half his torso opened while Gareon's servo arms harvested viable progenoids from a dead comrade and prepared immediate implantation support for later use. Mortal chirurgeons in blood-lacquered aprons carried pails of ruined organs to rendering bins, while combat servitors held screaming patients immobile under restraint spikes. "Stabilize the useful," Garyon ordered in a tone of serene contempt. "Amputate the doubtful. Harvest the dead before their chemistry turns spiteful. Move the next." A corsair on one slab was still conscious, despite the fact that most of his lower jaw and one lung lay in a tray beside him. Garyon leaned over the warrior, his lenses narrowing as they read internal diagnostics. "You may live," the warrior tried to reply. It emerged as pink froth. "Provided," Garyon continued, driving a line of injector needles into his ruined throat, "that you remember survival is an earned privilege rather than a sentimental entitlement." The crypt ran with blood. St. Niches dripped with it. Icon lamps reflected in it. Men died there under blades and salvation alike, and Garyon preserved enough of them to keep the campaign biting. Deeper beneath the hive, none of that mattered. The machine complex had begun to wake. At first, the signs were subtle. Dead lumen strips flared white without power feeds. Dust rose from the floor in neat, angular patterns no vibration could explain. A wall that had seemed seamless suddenly extruded rune-like ridges beneath centuries of grime. Then the whole buried architecture answered the bombardment above with power surges that rippled through the black metal skeleton like nervous impulses in a waking beast. Karen felt it through his boots. Morval's sensorium fed him impossible readings. Distances no longer agreed with themselves. A corridor measured one length, then another, without any visible movement in its walls. A chamber ceiling unfolded into faceted planes for the span of a blink and returned to stone. Human bodies left too near the deeper conduits began to twitch long after death, not from life, but from current. "Impossible geometry," Morval murmured, half disgusted, half delighted. Something below is solving itself. Then every lumen in the gallery ahead burst at once, not from overload, from command. Darkness rushed in, hard and total, not the honest dark of a buried ruin, but a darkness with intent, imposed in a clean line across a whole warfront. Vox static climbed, Auspex returns smeared. Above ground, in the ruined transit sectors, along the reliquary districts, and through the corpse avenues where Imperials and traitors hacked at each other amid burning statues, the lights died in sequence. Habstacks, vehicle lamps, shrine beacons, command strobes, defense towers, all swallowed in one widening sweep. Far above, Iriel's Corsairs completed the cut. They had reached the orbital relay arrays and power distribution spines feeding the main hive's contested districts. A pair of elegant strike craft slipped between defensive arcs and severed the final linkages with surgical lance fire. What remained of the local grid collapsed inward. Emergency backups flared, were jammed, and failed. The entire warfront below dropped into a false night lit only by fire, muzzle flashes, and the cold, fitful glow of burning wreckage descending from the heavens. For a long breath, the battle hesitated. Imperials blind, Corsairs blind, Night Lords grinning in the dark. Somewhere in that blackness, sleek alien killers moved as though the absence of light had simply restored the universe to proper order. Then the screaming began again, and the war entered a darker shape. The false night over Gethsemane Tertius did not last long enough to bring mercy. It lasted only long enough to make men understand how blind they truly were. The hive fought on beneath its murdered lumens by firelight, tracer glare and the corpse glow of burning wreckage still descending from the heavens. Processional roads became red rivers of muzzle flashes and screaming silhouettes. Cathedral transepts boomed with blind exchanges of lasfire and bolter bursts. Tanks fired at engine heat and prayer noise. Men stabbed at shadows that answered with chain blades. Somewhere in the upper dark, the Aldari were still moving, precise as scalpels, cutting nerves no human commander could see. Somewhere below, the machine complex throbbed awake beneath the dead. Then the void above the shrine world tore open to admit a different species of disaster. No warning net formed around it. No disciplined. Relays tracked it in time. The first sign was a rain of junk metal glints on auger returns, where none had been a moment earlier, scattered, tumbling, too crude to pass cleanly. Then the glints became engine wakes. Then the wakes multiplied until it seemed that a whole moon, made from wreckage, had broken apart and hurled itself toward the war. The orcs came in laughing. Their fleet was not a formation so much as a riot given engines. Hulks plated in mismatched armor and shrine debris came lunging out of the Maelstrom's edge, with exhaust plumes like dirty comets. Ramships the size of small cities spun under half-functional thrust, their prows sheathed in scrap iron tusks and looted adamantium that had once belonged to better vessels. Gun crawlers draped in dangling chains and stolen void bells fired broadsides in every direction at once, as likely to smash an ally as an enemy. Engine cages glowed white, where plasma leaks vented through patchwork hulls. Boarding craft vomited from. Launch bays already on fire. Great plates of welded junk swung from their sides like armor scales on a diseased beast. They plunged into the void battle, not with strategy, but appetite. The first ramship hit a Red Corsair escort broadside before any sane gunner would have believed the angle possible. The impact tore the pirate vessel in half, shearing through magazine decks and command shrines alike, yet the orc hulk barely slowed. Grapples punched outward. Boarding bridges slammed across the joined wreckage. Green bodies in rusted plates and trophy masks roared through the smoke, firing crude weapons, swinging axes, tearing whole hatches off with bare hands. They were not seeking command nodes or supply manifests. They were seeking noise, resistance, the joy of finding an enemy still warm enough to fight back. A second orc ship drove directly into the remains of a defense bastion already crippled by the traitor assault. It rammed through gun decks, lodged itself amid the station's spine, and began disgorging boarders from every split seam. The bastion's interior vox flooded with brutal laughter, impacts, guttural boasts, and the wet thunder of decompression. A pilgrim hulk nearby tried to turn clear and instead caught a chain-shot broadside from a passing orc killer frigate. Its cathedral dome ruptured. Thousands of civilians spilled into vacuum beneath a stained glass image of the Emperor that rotated away into darkness, while a dozen greenskin boarders leapt after the wreckage simply because it looked entertaining. "What did I tell you?" one orc bellowed over an open capture frequency as he hacked through an airlock with a weapon better suited to industrial murder than war. "Told you there'd be loot, fire, and panicky little gits all over the place." Another voice, louder and closer to madness, answered with a bark of approval. "This one's mine. That one's mine too. If I can kick it, it's mine." Captain Goriskull himself rode at the heart of the invasion like a crowned engine of stupidity and success. His flagship, a monstrous assemblage of looted armor, grafted gun decks and protruding ram jaws, looked less built than accumulated through generations of victorious collision. He stood upon its forward command gantry in a great coat of stolen banners, iron jaw tusks plated in brass, and one eye replaced by a targeting scope the size of a child's fist. Around him, gunners whooped, brawled, and fired at anything moving, while voidsmen, half crushed into servitude, dragged fresh shells to batteries that had no firing discipline and no need for one. Goriskull spat a gob of dark oil and phlegm onto the deck. "That's a proper scrap. Red humies, black humies, shiny pointy gits, praying humies, ships, fire, big booms. Mork's teeth, I'm gonna be rich." His first mate, an orc with a chain hook for one arm and half a pilot's chair bolted to his back, pointed toward the thickest tangle of pirate logistics traffic. "Dem ones look important. Den ram 'em harder." Organized war dissolved on impact. Dagon Varkas felt it happen across his command net like a disciplined man hearing a cathedral roof cave in above him. Relay reports that had already been degraded by the Aeldari knives now became lunatic. Supply routes vanished under green borders. Outer screen elements began firing on impossible threat vectors. One ammunition lighter tried to hard burn out of an orc interception lane and drove directly into the drifting wreck of its own escort, detonating both. A Corsair troop barge transmitted a furious demand for reinforcement from beneath simultaneous boarding actions by greenskins and panicked pilgrims who had somehow seized cutting torches and were trying to reclaim their own decks in the confusion. Dagon looked upon the developing debacle with the stillness of a man who wanted to strangle the universe with his own hands, and knew that would not improve timing. New doctrine, he snapped. All non-essential convoy routes abandoned. Pull back exposed logistics to concentric kill zones around the primary descent lanes. Scrap the outer picket pattern. Use the orcs against the defenders where possible. Do not contest every position. Withdraw from anything that cannot be held at profit. One of his lieutenants hesitated. Captain, if we cede the eastern lane, we lose half our surface resupply. If we keep it, Dagon said, we feed it to greenskins and Xenos. Withdraw. This was the humiliation at the core of Red Corsair pragmatism. No heroic stand. No delusion of honor in holding useless ground because blood had already been spent there. Dagon adjusted, cut loose, collapsed lines where needed, and rebuilt them around utility. Boarding kill zones were seeded with chained fuel pods and overlapping gun arcs. Decoy freighters were pushed into orc approach lanes before being detonated remotely. Vulnerable loading towers on the surface were abandoned, and then shelled once the greenskins swarmed into them. Selective withdrawal kept the campaign alive where pride would have killed it. He hated every second of it because it looked like retreat, and pirates survived by smelling weakness faster than blood. Yet he did it anyway. That was why Huron trusted him. On the surface, the orcs fell from the sky in dirty miracles of iron and bad intention. Looted landers slammed into plazas, hab tiers and transit causeways already weakened by bombardment. Ramshackle walkers with pistons screaming and iconography painted over in obscene greens burst through breach lines trailing smoke and severed cables. Trucks roared out of impact craters on wheels made from shrine bells, rail couplings and tank sprockets, their engines coughing black fire as mobs of freebooters fired wildly from the flatbeds. They did not distinguish carefully between Imperial fallback positions and pirate supply lanes. They smashed whichever thing was nearest and loud enough to be satisfying. A column of exhausted PDF armor trying to withdraw from the reliquary wards was hit from the flank by 3 looted walkers painted in naval hazard stripes and devotional gold. One tank was split open by a circular saw arm that screamed through turret ring and crew alike, showering the avenue with steaming meat. A second was flipped onto its side by a truck fitted with a ram prow made from a church gate. The surviving tank fired point blank into the mob piling over it, killing orcs, civilians, and its own infantry escort in one white blast, before a greenskin with an oversized boarding axe hacked through the vision slit and dragged the commander out by the spine. Across another district, orc boarders, who had somehow descended intact inside a shattered pilgrim liner, used its wrecked hull as rolling cover while pushing toward a Corsair ammunition dump. The dump's guards died in a blur of crude slugs, thrown blades, and joyous impact violence. When the munitions finally went up, the explosion launched bits of orc and Corsair across half the ward and made the surviving greenskins cheer because something had exploded properly. Karen Vale watched this new delirium from the lip of a collapsed mortuary shaft and understood at once that Providence, if such a thing existed, had the humor of a torturer. 3 armies, Varjast voxed, looking over the heat blooms and moving swarms. 4 if one counts the Eldari in the walls. Count only what we can bleed, Sev replied. Karen shook his head. No, count confusion. It is worth more than troops. Above them, the Red Corsairs were trying to force order through a battlefield that had become a carnival of interruptions. The Imperials were committing their last coherent formations to stop everything at once. The orcs were smashing apart any line still identifiable as one. Somewhere in the upper dark, the Eldari still cut with cold intent. It was too much for any command structure, built on reason, which made it perfect. Take the upper galleries and let them all see one another, Karen ordered. No quarter, no fixed line, Strike, vanish, strike again. Break the Imperials onto the Orcs. Break the Orcs onto the Corsairs. We go down while they kill at the sound. Sev's laughter came hard and hungry. Now you are preaching. The Night Lords spread into the confusion like a disease finding open veins. They opened fire from shadowed balconies into Imperial rear ranks, then vanished before return volleys came back. They butchered isolated Orc looters and hung the remains where Red Corsairs would find them and assumed the Greenskins had turned on one another. They sabotaged transit supports so that stampeding pilgrims toppled into avenues just as Imperial armor tried to redeploy, then stalked the wreckage, picking off survivors who crawled free. Every act of violence was chosen not only for death, but for misdirection. They let 3 armies tear at one another while their own chosen claw descended through cracked crypts and machine-fed shafts toward the deeper vault. Behind them, the dialogue of the war became savage and absurd in equal measure. Orc voices bellowed over stolen command channels. "Oi, Red Humies, dis your ammo, it's my ammo now. Look at this little black one lurking. Sneaky git, I like him, shoot him." Who set all dis on fire? That was a good idea. Corsair officers answered with snarl-flat fury. Kill the Greenskins before they reach the lift core. If that truck breaches the munitions nave, I will skin whoever survives it. Stop wasting rounds on the stampede. Shoot the things with engines. Night Lords replied in black amusement from the dark. Listen to them count crates while the world dies. Do not kill that priest yet. He is almost interesting. Sev, the Orc with the gold hat is mocking your chainblade technique. Imperial prayer chant tried to answer all of it and broke beneath the strain. The Emperor protects. The Emperor Hold the line. Hold the line. Hold. St. Gethsemar receive our... Then, only screaming. Marshal Enoch Van committed the last of his regiments in the cathedral approaches when he understood that the war had escaped every category he possessed for it. He no longer fought merely traitors. Xenos had entered from the sky and from between the lines. Civilians were a hazard as much as a burden. The lower sanctum routes had already suffered collapse and breach in equal measure. The world could no longer be saved, only delayed, so he became delay. His remaining core regiments, those few disciplined companies not yet bled white in the counterattacks, formed kill wedges around the lower cathedral ingress, while pilgrim levies and Hab militia filled the gaps with bodies, mines, and prayer banners soaked in fuel. Tanks that could still move were driven into the broadest approaches and immobilized, deliberately to become armored bastions. Ammunition was handed out without record. Confessors walked the line with execution pistols and scripture scrolls. Van himself stood atop a wrecked cargo hauler turned command post, saber in one hand, vox bead in the other, face blackened by soot and someone else's blood. "Seal the lower sanctum," he ordered. A colonel below him looked up through the smoke. "There are still our own down there." "There are always our own down there," Van said. "Seal it." The final defensive line met all 3 attackers and died as though trying to prove a point to history. Orc mobs slammed into the barricades with roaring delight and were shredded by heavy bolters until the survivors climbed over the bodies of the dead and came on anyway. Red Corsair raiders carved through the flanks seeking passages rather than glory, killing officers, demolition teams, and anyone holding vault codes. Night Lords struck where morale was weakest, turning each local collapse into terror magnified beyond its actual size. Through it all, the defenders fired, reloaded, prayed, bayoneted, and burned. Men fought waist-deep in their own dead. Pilgrim levies detonated mine satchels against charging orcs and vanished in green blood and red vapor alike. One regiment held a stair approach until every officer was dead, then kept firing by the shouted count of a Vox operator whose lower half had already been torn away. They delayed all 3 invading forces long enough. The sanctum doors far below, already half buried beneath ancient stone and machine ribs, ground shut under emergency seals and demolition counterweights. Whatever lay beneath them was once more sealed from immediate reach. when the last of Van's line finally broke. It did so, not in flight, but in extinction. The Marshal was seen one final time atop the burning hauler, shooting a greenskin through the eye at sword length, while bellowing for charges to be lit under the avenue itself. Then the orcs hit, the corsairs flanked, the Night Lords descended through the chaos behind them, and the command post vanished beneath bodies, smoke, and collapsing masonry. Karen found Garland's Soul Eater waiting for him in the deeper approach tunnels below the ruined sanctum, as if the sorcerer had known the exact shape the battle would take, and had chosen his place in it like an actor choosing light. He stood before a half-exposed section of the black metal complex, while sparks ran along the walls in thin green insects of current. Around him, a handful of dead lay in neat arrangement, their blood forming lines that matched no imperial ritual Karen cared to know. "You are late," Garland said. "You are alive," Karen replied. "Both facts offend me." Garland smiled. "Then let me improve your mood. The thing below is not merely a chart engine. Huron allowed that lie because simple men obey simple prizes. But you, I think, deserve the uglier truth." Sev spat a gob of dark blood onto the floor. Careful, he might blush. Garland ignored him. His eyes remained on Karen. "The Noctis compass is an intelligence, not human, not machine in any comfortable sense, warp-bound but not free. It has been caged in architecture, fed on signal, death and direction for longer than this world remembers. It does not merely calculate routes through the storm. It desires them. It whispers them. It bargains. The old builders imprisoned a mouth and convinced later empires it was an instrument. For one rare instant, even Varjast said nothing. Karen felt the old pressure stir behind his eyes. "And you knew?" "Of course." Garland spread his hands. "Would Huron spend fleets and worlds for a navigational device alone? We have augurs. We have sorcery. We have slaves enough to drown 1,000 charts in blood and still find our way by suffering. No, he wants a captive oracle with teeth." Sev let out a low, ugly laugh. "And you waited until now to mention that. You had not yet earned the whole secret." The floor shivered beneath them, not with bombardment this time, with something deeper and more intimate, like a sleeper turning beneath sheets of stone and bone. The walls brightened. Lines appeared where none had been, great curving seams of pale, sickly light. In the distance came the grinding scream of streets above being forced into new shapes. Then reality tore locally, but enough. The hive convulsed. Avenue lengths changed between one step and the next. Streets stretched like heated metal under a smith's hammer, then snapped back wrong, leaving men running into walls that had not been there a heartbeat before. Cathedral staircases developed impossible extra landings, descending into blackness. Saint statues bled from carved eyes and split mouths. Not thin tears, but steady streams of dark red fluid that ran down their marble cheeks and pooled at their feet. Vox towers began broadcasting whispers beneath. The static, routes, bearings, names of storm lanes no living navigator on the planet should have known. The dead, lying in the streets, and crypts stirred only enough to speak. Broken jaws worked. Ruined throats hissed. Corpses, with half their faces gone, breathed out coordinates into the dust. "This way, through the wound." 3 turns starward, and the red path opens. "Not that lane. That lane eats sons." Pilgrims fell to their knees weeping. Orcs laughed and kicked talking corpses apart, only to hear the whispers continue from the severed heads. Corsairs cursed, recalibrated, and lost men to distances that no longer agreed with maps. Night Lords listened more carefully than they admitted. High above, even the Aeldari found their clean geometry interrupted by a city beginning to remember older mathematics. Karen stood in the red-lit dark beneath the sanctum seals and heard the hive itself begin to murmur roots through the Maelstrom in the voices of the dead. At last, he thought, the world had started screaming in a language worth learning. By the time Karen Vale led the descent into the lower vaults, the war above had lost all proportion. It still existed, certainly, The hive still shook to the tread of armor, the crash of collapsing cathedra, the riotous bark of orc engines, and the endless percussion of guns. Yet down here, those things had become weather. Distant, meaningless thunder rolling through kilometers of stone, bone, and buried machine. A whole world was dying overhead, and the deeper the strike force descended, the less it mattered. The dead above were simply adding weight to the foundations. Karen went first through the breach passage, his chosen Night Lords flowing behind him in midnight plate, scabbed with ash, blood, and masonry dust. Dagenvarkas followed with a hand-picked knot of Red Corsair raiders, stripped down for close penetration fighting, their armor scarred and practical, their weapons chosen for reliability over spectacle. Morval moved among them like a Medici wraith, Narthesium folded close, helm optics drinking every lumen fluctuation and body heat remnant. Behind that first spear point came more survivors, fewer than any of them would have preferred. Enough to matter, and not enough to waste. The Sanctum seals Van's dying regiments had bought with their annihilation lay cracked now, their lower edges peeled outward by melter and shape charges. But the breach through them was narrow and ugly. The defenders who had tried to hold it in the last minutes of their lives were still there, crushed into the gap with traitors, pilgrims, and greenskins alike. Armor, robes, flak harness, tusks, severed hands, and prayer medals had been compacted into a single human blockage by blast pressure and panic. The strike force climbed through them rather than over them. Bones snapped under ceramite boots. Fluids ran in the seams of the threshold. One partially living thing somewhere in the meat wall whimpered when Dagon planted a boot in its rib cage and used it for leverage. Then they were through, and the vaults opened. No one spoke at first. The complex beneath Gethsemane Tertius had not been built by a single species, faith, or century. That was instantly obvious, even before the deeper horrors declared themselves. The upper approaches still bore the devotional masonry of imperial burial work, black marble walls inlaid with brass scripture, reliquary alcoves, ossuary shelves, and censer tracks built into the ceilings. Beneath and behind that lay older strata where the lines changed. Stone became denser, darker, cut with an accuracy human masons only imitated when their gods were watching. Machine ribs showed through where crypt walls had split, not Mechanicus pattern, not anything that believed in comfort or maintenance access. Those surfaces curved in ways that denied efficient manufacture and yet fit together with impossible exactness. Between these layers stood additions, from unknown intervening ages. Shrine rails welded onto ancient conduits, cogitator banks mounted inside alcoves once used for corpse storage, processional mosaics interrupted by blackstone buttresses that looked as though they had grown rather than been raised. "It is a tomb," Var Yast said, over the squad channel. Morval answered at once. "It is a machine." Sev gave a low chuckle. "It is a shrine to very bad decisions." All of them were right. The passages twisted downward in branching spirals, each descent cut by archways bearing symbols that no longer agreed with one another. Imperial skull icons over older sunbursts, half-erased sigils beneath devotional engravings, warning glyphs carved into the edges of saint statues, whose faces had been recut multiple times by successive ages, trying to make the old look holy. Every civilization that had found this place, it seemed, had inherited it already misunderstood and chosen to lie about it in a different language. The first wired corpses appeared 3 galleries below the breach. They hung seated in rows against the walls like dead courtiers at a private audience, rotted into bronze lattice chairs and plugged into ancient cogitator arrays by cables fed through jaw hinges, spines, and eye sockets. Some still wore fragments of priestly robes or burial wrappings. Others had been stripped to parchment skin and wires. Metal circlets clamped their temples. Their fingers had been fused over input studs blackened by centuries of touch. When the strike force entered the chamber, one of the corpses lifted its chin with a sound like wet parchment tearing from stone. Its mouth opened. "Third descent on the left," it said in the voice of a child. Another twitched in its chair. "Do not follow the green pulse. It leads into hunger." A third began laughing in a dead old man's voice that shifted halfway through into a woman's sob, then into a military vox monotone reciting route codes to a long-collapsed transit sector above. The raiders raised weapons at once. Night Lords did not. They listened. More mouths opened. More stolen voices spilled out. Some whispered directions. Some spat prophecies. Some lied with the smoothness of long practice. "A crowned corpse waits below and knows your name. Turn back, son of murder. The path beneath the seventh saint opens into the red lane. The tyrant will sit on a throne of numbers and choke. Prince of Knives already runs ahead of you. Only one of you has already died." Dagon shot one through the face, simply to see whether the talking would stop. The corpse's skull burst backward in a puff of dust and bone splinters. Its jaw continued working, the voice now bubbling from a speaker grill buried somewhere behind the wall. "Incorrect solution," it said. Dagon looked at the wall, then at Karen. "We waste no more time on theatrics." Karen looked along the rows of speaking dead. "This place wishes to be noticed. That is not the same as theatre." Dagon's reply came clipped and hard. "Wishes are for those still alive. We seize the engine, cage it, move it, and sell the galaxy its own throat. Everything else is atmosphere." There was the pure Red Corsair instinct, stripped to steel. He did not care whether the thing below was haunted, ancient, profane, or self-aware. If it could be bound, it could be owned. If it could be owned, it could be sold, or taxed, or leveraged into empire. That simplicity made him dangerous, in a way more mystical men often were not. Morval crouched before one of the wired corpses and peeled back the ragged vestments with the tip of a surgical talon. Beneath the cloth, the ribcage had been opened long ago and reinforced with antique metal sutures. Wires ran through the emptied cavity into deeper machinery behind the wall. Residue crystals glimmered in the sternum hollow. "Martyr feed," Morval murmured. "Look here." He cut, deeper. Ancient, desiccated organs crumbled under his tools. Along the fused wiring junctions were deposits of old blood salts, layered generation upon generation thick. "This place has been fed," he said. "Not occasionally, systematically. They did not merely bury their holy dead here. They plugged them in, repeatedly, generation after generation, martyr by martyr, to keep something below in a receptive state." Dagon gave him a flat glance. "Speak in usefulness." Morval rose, holding a thread of blackened nerve fiber between his forceps. "The machine dreams paths through the Maelstrom. The dreams require blood, signal, and minds dying in directed patterns. Martyrs were used as fuel, stabilizers, mnemonic anchors. Their deaths taught the mechanism where certainty could still survive inside the storm." He looked around the chamber with something like disgusted admiration. "They fed it sainthood until it learned navigation." Karen heard that and felt the old pressure behind his eyes stir again. Fed. Dreaming. It fit too cleanly with the whispers, the visions, the way the hive had begun speaking roots through its dead. This was no treasure waiting to be claimed. This was bait left singing in the dark so that predators, kings and prophets alike, would descend toward it in orderly ruin. "It wants us below," he said. Dagon snorted. "Of course it does. Everything worth owning attracts company." "No," Karen's voice hardened. "It wants us below specifically. That is different." Sev laughed softly. "Then let it be disappointed in person." They pressed on. The lower vaults alternated between crypt galleries and chambers too industrial to be devotional, yet too ornate to be purely functional. One hall contained rows of saint bones mortared into the walls around a humming reactor column of black metal and brass. Another opened into a chapel whose altar had been built atop what was unmistakably a machine access dais, though whatever mechanism it had once served was buried under centuries of scripture plates and dried blood offerings. Here and there, the geometry altered subtly as they passed, distances flexing by a step or two, angles sharpening, archways rising higher once their backs were turned. The dead continued speaking from wall arrays and floor nodes, sometimes in whispers right beneath their boots. Then Garyon caught up with them. He arrived not like reinforcement, but like a mobile abattoir. The corpse master came through a side gallery with a retinue of fresh surgical horrors dragged in his wake, red corsairs who had been triaged, cut open, rebuilt, and sent back down before their pain had time to become memory. Some walked on newly grafted augmetic limbs still wet with sealant. One raider had lost half his lower face and now wore a crude iron grill stapled directly into exposed cheekbone. Another moved with a stitched abdominal plate over a cavity that should still have been on a slab. Behind them came reanimated servitor butchers, made from wounded too depleted to salvage as warriors, but too useful to discard. Their higher thought had been erased or cored away. Rotary saws replaced hands. One carried a cluster of injector spears where an arm had been. Another dragged a chain of blood collection canisters behind him, the containers sloshing thick and black. Garyon himself was lacquered to the elbows in fresh gore. "I culled the weak," he said, as though discussing ration adjustments. "These remain cost-effective." Sev looked the returning warriors over and gave an appreciative grunt. "You have improved them by removing the parts that complained." Garyon's lenses clicked toward him. "I improve everything by removing the parts that complain." Morval eyed the servitor butchers with professional curiosity. "And the others?" "Rendered," Garyon said. "Their organs will continue serving the campaign more reliably in distributed form." Dagon did not waste breath on revulsion. "You are late." "I was preserving your operational viability," Garyon answered. "The distinction matters only to those who intend to survive." Before Dagon could reply, shuriken screamed through the dark. The first volley came from a high crypt balcony to the left, monomolecular discs shearing through two red corsairs before anyone had fully identified the angle. One lost his head cleanly, helm and all. The second had both forearms severed at the elbow and fell back in geysers of transhuman blood. The next volley came from the opposite side, lower and farther away, cutting a servitor butcher apart at the spine and filling the gallery with whipping cables and machine oil. "Eldari," Karan voxed. He was already moving. Iriel's elite hunters had entered by another route, slipping through the vault complex with the same cold precision their kin had shown in the void. But here, there would be no distant cutting. No, careful severing of relays from safe remove. The galleries narrowed, the lines of fire shortened. This would be fought breath to breath, blade to blade, among saints, conduits, and corpses. The running battle that followed was vicious even by the standards of the war above. Eldari hunters moved through the crypt galleries like blades given legs, pale armor flashing between columns, every shot exact, every retreat already a lure toward another angle of death. Red Corsair raiders answered with disciplined aggression, breaching through side walls, flanking through maintenance shafts, and using demo charges to collapse clean lanes where speed alone would lose them. Night Lords thrived in the shadows between those styles, ambushing the ambushers, striking where the Xenos had overextended by a fraction, and vanishing before the return cuts could close. In a reactor chapel, lined with Saint Skulls and bronze heat pipes, Sev met one of the Eldari hunters at arm's reach and discovered that arrogance could in fact be elegant. The Xenos duelist slipped beneath his first chainblade sweep and drove a glittering knife through the seam at Sev's gorget, only for the blade to jam on a reinforcement collar, unseen in the dark. Sev laughed, head-butted the alien hard enough to crack its helm crest, then slammed his chainblade upward through hip and torso in a shower of blue-white blood, luminous organs and armor shards. "Too delicate," he snarled, kicking the body away. Elsewhere, Varyast shot one hunter through a wall, by reading the ripple of dust that marked its passage. Gary and servitor butchers cornered another in a reliquary transept and reduced it to ribbons of pale flesh, the machine things hacking until the walls were striped in alien blood. Morval dragged a wounded Xenos into cover, not to save it, but to saw one arm off at the shoulder and examine the joint structure before finally puncturing the throat sacs with an injector claw. Still they came. Iriel had not sent rabble. He had sent killers noble enough to serve as scalpels at the end of his will. They struck, withdrew, reappeared in force where the strike line weakened, forcing Karen's mixed spear point onward and sideways through chambers they might otherwise have bypassed. Then the two leaders met at last. It happened in a long crypt corridor, where the walls were lined with seated dead wired into blackstone lecterns, all of them muttering routes and warnings in voices stolen from the forgotten. The firefight had burned itself short there, both sides momentarily reduced to a handful of survivors on either end of the chamber. Smoke drifted low over the floor. Broken St. Statuary lay in heaps between them. A raider bled out against one wall, still trying to reload by reflex with fingers that no longer listened. Prince Iriel stepped into view at the far end of the corridor with the calm poise of a lord entering a private garden, not a charnel vault. His armor caught the weak lumen in silver-edged planes. The spear in his hand was canted low, every line of him balanced, exact and intolerably alive. Around him moved the remnants of his elite, silent as knives held back for one decisive thrust. Karen stepped from behind a toppled ossuary slab to face him, bolt pistol low, chainblade idle at his side for the moment. Dust and blood coated his midnight armor. His bare face was streaked dark from old visions and fresher war. For one thin breath, the chamber listened. The wired dead muttered around them. Left starward to the red wound. The crowned one devours maps. Do not trust the beautiful corpse. Iriel's lip curled very slightly at the sound of it. When he spoke, his voice was cool enough to shame the Blackstone. Your species breaks every prison it touches, then calls the ruin destiny. Karen almost smiled. And yours mistakes distance for superiority. The thing below must die. And yet here you are, killing your way toward it rather than vaporizing the whole district from orbit. Iriel's gaze sharpened. Because lesser beings are too savage to survive their own victories. That does not mean I must be wasteful when ending them. Karen looked along the chamber, at the dead wired to walls, at the blood on ancient metal, at the tunnel beyond where something vast and patient waited to be reached. Do not posture to me about waste, Prince. You are here because your empire is also a graveyard teaching itself to pretend. We are all predators picking flesh from older bones. For the first time, a hint of emotion touched Iriel's face. Not anger. Recognition curdled by disgust. Then perhaps, he said, you at least understand why your kind cannot be allowed one more road through the storm. The pause ended in gunfire. Both sides moved at once, words discarded as luxuries of species still vain enough to think themselves unobserved. Karen's pistol barked. Iriel turned just enough that the round only scorched his shoulder plate. In the same motion, the prince's spear flicked, and a bright line of force lanced down the corridor, punching through a red corsair behind Karen and hurling the body backward in a detonation of armor and spine. Night Lords surged. Aeldari answered. The corridor became a storm of close murder, muzzle flashes strobing across seated dead whose mouths kept whispering directions even as rounds tore them apart. The fight drove both forces toward the same destination. Doors of blackstone and brass gave way under combined violence. Antechambers collapsed. A reactor chapel exploded behind them, blowing St. Bones through the air in white storms. Dagon lost 3 more raiders and gained 20 meters of ground. Garion's butcher servitors died buying a flanking lane that allowed Sev to butcher 2 of Iriel's hunters with point-blank bolt fire. Morval kept moving no matter what fell around him, pausing only long, enough to strip useful organs from the fresh dead with abhorrent efficiency. Then the final threshold opened. The core chamber lay beyond a set of half-ruined cyclopean doors, whose surfaces had been engraved, defaced, sanctified, re-engraved, and plated over by so many ages that meaning itself seemed layered there like scar tissue. When the doors parted under melter and force, a wind came out of the chamber carrying ozone, old blood, hot brass, incense residue, and something else. Something like the smell inside a vox altar when it begins speaking in a dead man's voice. They entered. For the first time since the descent began, even Dagon stopped speaking. The Noctis compass stood at the heart of the chamber like a captured god of direction. It was colossal, rising through the vault's full height in rings, spines, suspended arms and turning geometries too vast to comprehend at once. Brass dominated first, but not pure brass. Brass veined with black corrosion, inscribed with shifting root markings, and set with rotating astrolabe circles large enough to hang cities from. Black stone buttresses anchored the lower structure, swallowing light rather than reflecting it. Some bones had been built into housings and arrays everywhere. Femurs as conduits, ribcages forming cages around glowing cores, skulls set into brass collars with cables thrust through their mouths and eye sockets. Between the great rings burned caged warp light, not fire, not plasma, but something luminous and hateful that strained against invisible restraints and cast shadows pointing in contradictory directions. Needles of impossible size turned in silence above a throne-like nexus of cables, data veins, and blood-black sockets. Runes flowed across the air around it. The whole engine seemed to breathe in pulses, measured not by time, but by choices. Karen felt it at once. Not as machinery, as a tension. The chamber's vastness fell inward around that realization, and every war above, every death, every fleet and world and king seemed suddenly to have been only the necessary noise made by meat descending toward a mouth that had always known they were coming. The first sign of Huron Blackheart's arrival was not sound, but obedience. Across the core chamber, amidst the rotating brass immensities of the Noctis compass and the corpse-littered wreckage of the fight that had driven them this far, every red corsair still capable of standing altered position by instinct alone. Raiders bloodied almost beyond function straightened where they knelt. Survivors dragging wounded into cover left them where they fell. Vox traffic cut short, guns shifted. Men who had spent the whole campaign cursing, bargaining, bleeding and improvising remembered all at once that they belonged to a kingdom, and that its master had come in person to collect what he believed already his. Then the doors behind the strike force blew outward in sheets of molten blackstone and shattered brass. Huron entered through smoke, sparks, and dead light, with Terminators at his shoulders and chosen killers fanning behind him in a wall of crimson-black plate. He did not hurry. He did not duck the hissing debris or the bursts of shurikens still ricocheting from the chamber's distant ribs. He walked as though returning to a throne room whose servants had merely grown untidy during his absence. The iron ruin of his body moved with a measured certainty, made more terrible by the visible machinery required to sustain it. Pistons locked beneath his armor, cables flexed at the ruined architecture of his chest. One gauntlet crackled with caged power. Yet none of that diminished him. It had become part of the statement he made simply by crossing the threshold. He was a carcass too hateful to stop ruling. Fire burned in pits around the chamber, where broken conduits spat warp-bright discharge. Corpses lay in drifts between the buttresses of the Noctis compass. Red Corsairs, Night Lords, Eldari, and mortals all opened alike by the war that had funneled them here. Above, through kilometers of stone and hive, the whole planet was dying loudly enough to tremble the foundations. Huron ignored all of it, with the same calm a conqueror might give spilled wine. "Stand aside," he said. He did not shout. He did not need to. Dagon Varkas obeyed first, though every line of his body spoke of a man who loathed relinquishing any field he had bled for. His raiders widened the lane toward the central nexus, where the compass rose around its throne-like control core. Garyon came with Huron's column, mechadendrites stained almost black with blood and sealant, lenses whirring as they assessed every wound and angle between his master and the objective. Karen Vale watched them advance and felt the chamber itself respond. The Noctis compass awakened fully. Until that moment it had seemed active, yes, whispering, pulsing, leaning into awareness. Now it came alive in the way a buried god might come alive when the right sacrifices finally bleed upon the right stones. The great brass rings overhead accelerated in silence. Blackstone fins along the lower housing unfolded like the opening of impossible petals. The caged warp light at its heart blazed brighter, not illuminating the chamber so much as informing it of a new reality. Every wall, floor, body and weapon surface became a screen for projection. Storm roots spilled across the chamber in rivers of luminous sigils. Navigational paths through the Maelstrom arced over fallen corpses and broken pillars alike, each route pulsing with probabilities, blood costs, fleet tonnage, attrition expectations and names in languages no human throat should have retained. Fleet graves followed, vast images of future wreck fields blooming across the walls where pirate armadas drifted broken amid burning stars. Future raids unfurled in jagged sequence, shrine worlds opening like butchered animals, forge moons taken intact, convoy, lines strangled, sector capitals set to panic by fleets arriving through impossible lanes. Then came alternate histories, crueler still. A Gethsemane Tertius that had never been found, fat and pious and useful for another century. A Huron Blackheart dead on Badab's ash and never crowned by storm. A Night Lord's warband devoured in the dark before ever reaching the fortress. 100 outcomes, 1,000. All of them layered atop one another until the chamber became an atlas of atrocities real, possible and hungry to become so. Men stopped shooting to stare. Even the Aeldari hesitated. Iriel recovered first. "The engine dies now," he said, and launched his final strike. His elite came at once from the flanks and upper galleries, silent no longer, their last reserve of precision spent in a single decisive thrust. Needle-thin beams lanced for the central control nexus. Shuriken storms ripped across Red Corsair lines, shaving armor into sparks and flesh into ribbons. Iriel himself moved like a thrown thought, spear low, every step already part of the next 3 deaths. Dagon swore and hurled his remaining raiders into the intercept. "Secure the throne node. No one touches the core housing. Break them." Karen did not move at once. He was staring at the shifting projections and at the compass itself as understanding began to sharpen inside his skull like a blade finding purchase. The visions, the whispers, the storm calling him by name. He had believed them warnings, taunts, prophecy, perhaps even invitation. They had been none of those things. They had been lures. The Maelstrom had not shown futures to avert disaster. It had baited the path toward it with images exactly poisonous enough to draw men like him downward, through slaughter, through empire, through pride. It wanted a warlord at its throat, not just any warlord, one ruthless enough to bind the thing and feed it more worlds. It wanted Huron. Karen began to laugh once, breathlessly, the sound almost buried beneath the chamber erupting into war. The 3-sided slaughter came down in confined darkness and hell light, with a savagery that made the war above seem almost abstract by comparison. Huron's Terminators crashed into Iriel's advancing elites like falling bastions, combi bolters chattering in concussive bursts that tore crypt masonry, Eldari bodies, and wired dead apart in equal measure. Iriel's hunters flowed around those iron masses, cutting at joints, visors, and cabling with blades, and directed force too exact to be wasted on armor plate they knew they could not breach. Red Corsair raiders fought below and between those giants, hurling charges, firing point blank into limbs and throats, dying by the handful to buy ground 1 meter at a time. Night Lords entered the killing like creatures finally restored to their natural weather. Sevdras came down from the side buttresses onto an Eldari pair and turned one into a red-blue spray of organs, against a brass support before the second could finish drawing its blade. Varjast fought in the strobing dark among shattered saint bones. his chainglaive reaping through wounded Corsair and Xenos alike when they strayed into his path. Morval moved through the carnage, collecting, cutting, injecting, preserving, as if the chamber were simply the most inconvenient operating theatre he had ever been gifted. The dead joined in too. Wired corpses torn half loose from the chamber walls spasmed to fresh instruction. Servo-haunted remnants dragged themselves through the blood by cable and broken hand, jaws clicking out root warnings that shifted into screams when rounds passed through their speakers. Warp light spilling from ruptured conduit cages began to clot into shapes at the edge of vision, half-figures made of storm static and human panic, manifestations that reached out with fingers of luminous wrongness before exploding into sprays of cold fire when hit. Reality had worn too thin. Here, the compass was no longer merely projecting futures, it was bleeding influence. Above, Gethsemane Tertius reached its own apex of suffering. The hive was collapsing in layered catastrophes. Orbital firestorms rained down through the false night, each impact consuming whole districts already drowning in stampedes and structural failure. Cathedral spires toppled, hab towers split from foundation to crown, processional roads sank into ruptured sublevels full of burning promethium and the dead whispering roots through the storm. Billions still lived up there for moments at a time, which was all the apocalypse required of them, before erasing the difference between population and ash. Huron reached the lower steps of the compass control throne, and the machine turned its full madness on him. The projections around him sharpened until they became intimate. Storm roots wrapped his armor like crowns of light. Fleet graves bloomed beneath his boots. Alternate lives opened before him. Temptations, threats, and insults. A future where he ruled not the Maelstrom, but trade corridors into the segmentum itself. Another where the compass devoured his mind and wore his body as a throne. Another where he knelt. Another where he had died nameless. Another where he became something beyond mortality and empire alike. The warp light caged in the machine flared and pressed against its bindings as if eager to make communion. Huron did not seek communion. He wanted mastery. That was the difference between tyrants and prophets, between sorcerers and kings. He did not descend into this grave to understand the thing. He came to chain it. He took another step toward the throne. Iriel saw it and broke through the melee with murderous certainty. His spear drove a clean line of force through the chest of one Terminator, blasting ceramite and transhuman organs across the brass floor. He vaulted the collapsing body and aimed the next thrust directly at Huron's exposed side, where cabling fed into iron over dead flesh. Garyon moved first. The Corpse Master threw himself across the line not with nobility, but with perfect professional instinct. The spear entered beneath his raised Narthesium arm, passed through half the meat and machinery of his torso, and emerged in a spray of black-red fluid, burning fragments, and ruptured organ sac. Garyon made no heroic sound. He simply locked the weapon in himself with both hands and all remaining mechadendrites, trapping the haft long enough to deny Iriel a clean withdrawal. Huron turned inside that heartbeat and struck. His gauntlet smashed into Iriel's side with the force of a breaching ram, throwing the Aeldari prince back across the steps in a detonation of cracked wraithbone, sparks, and blood. Iriel landed on one knee, one hand planted, still impossibly controlled despite the violence of the blow. Around them, his elite died, buying him another angle. Garyon sagged around the impaling spear. Half his chest was simply gone. His lenses flickered, refocused on Huron, and for the first time since Karen had seen him, the Corpse Master sounded strained. "Proceed," he said. Huron did not waste a word answering. He mounted the control throne. The chamber changed pitch at once. Cables rose from the throne base like awakened serpents and struck into his armor housings, his gorget interfaces, the machinery embedded in his ruined chest and spine. Warning runes screamed across every visible surface. The compass tried to flood him with itself, with roots, dead fleets, possible futures, and impossible bargains. Huron roared not in terror, but in fury at the presumption. He gripped the arms of the throne as brass and blackstone sank data spines into the throne architecture around him. Pistons in his harness locked. His broken body shook under the pressure. He bared his teeth and forced his head upright. "No!" He snarled at the machine, at the storm, at the projected futures trying to drown him. "You will not wear me." Karen felt the answer rather than heard it. It came through the projections, the whispers, the pressure behind his eyes. Not words, appetite, recognition. The compass had sought this. The Maelstrom had bent events toward this. It had wanted a will brutal enough to seize the throne and stubborn enough to survive the first embrace. A warlord who would not worship it, but harness it. That was the point. Not corruption in the simple sense. Distribution, expansion. A captive intelligence fed by martyrdom and storm would now be tied to a pirate empire, hungry for roots, plunder, and wider wounds. His visions had never been warnings. They had been the scent trail into a trap built for an emperor of scavengers. Sev landed beside him amid the carnage, helm cracked, one arm hanging wrong, chain blade dripping both human and Aeldari blood. "He is going to sit on that damned thing, is he not?" "Yes," Karen said. "Can we stop him? Can we stop?" Karen watched Garyon dying on the steps, Dagon screaming orders to secure the outer ring, Iriel gathering himself for one last impossible lunge, warp-born things boiling from cracked conduits, and Huron Blackheart wrestling an entire astromantic nightmare into submission by force of hatred. "No," he said. "We were brought here so he would not have to find the way alone." Iriel came again. His final strike was not for Huron this time, but for the machine itself. He hurled his spear-like judgment, every coil of force and ancestral skill in his body pouring through the throw. The weapon crossed the chamber as a line of silver annihilation aimed at the central cage of warp light just above the throne. Dagon saw the angle and screamed for intercept. Raiders fired, Night Lords fired, Terminators turned. Too slow. Garyon, dying on one knee with half his torso liquefied, used the last strength in his ruined mechadendrites to wrench himself upright and hurl his own collapsing bulk into the spear's path. The alien weapon punched through what remained of him, tore away the last functional portions of his body and deflected just enough. Instead of striking the warp cage true, it slammed into a brass blackstone support ring and detonated in a flare that ripped open reality for the space of a heartbeat. Cold fire poured out. Voices screamed in languages no living thing should inherit. 3 Eldari died where they stood, reduced to ash and luminous bone. 2 Corsairs were turned inside out by a pressure wave of impossible direction. Garyon simply ceased to possess a shape that could be called alive. But the cage held. Huron seized the moment. With a sound like a man strangling a god, he drove his will downward through the throne interfaces. The control dais beneath him ignited with root sigils. The compass answered in shrieking resistance, projecting whole fleet architectures into the air above the chamber, then specific nodes, hardpoints, systems, command relays, drive signatures, and navigational reliquaries corresponding not to Gethsemane Tertius, but to Huron's own armada waiting in the void above. Chain logic flashed between them. Data veins of warp light reached outward through space. "He is binding it," Morval said in something close to awe. No ritual circle, no pious compatibility, no communion. Huron was forcibly marrying the machine to his fleet architecture, grafting its root calculus and storm hunger into the bones of his warhost by command authority, pain tolerance, and naked predatory will. Ships above began to answer. Relays screamed. Drive systems rebooted on impossible vectors. Astropathic static turned into coherent lane signatures for the first time since the war began. The chamber convulsed. The Noctis compass lost its last pretense of dormancy and committed. Brass rings spun at velocities the eye could no longer track. Warp light bled through every seam, every corpse wired into the surrounding. Walls began shrieking root names at once. Above ground, the hive split further as localized reality failures rolled through its depths. In orbit, pirate vessels suddenly acquired viable storm lanes that had not existed a breath before. Iriel understood what had happened before anyone else, and the hatred on his face was almost holy. "You have doomed this region," he said. Huron, half entombed in cables and light, looked down at him with a smile made monstrous by strain and blood. "I have improved my borders." It was victory. It was also sentence. The objective was won. The system was not. The moment the binding took hold, Gethsemane Tertius became expendable in a new way. The compass no longer needed the world as cage architecture. The stabilizing martyr engine beneath the hive began to overload in ecstatic protest. New storm routes unfurled through the chamber and out into the void, while the foundations of the shrine world trembled toward dissolution. Whatever remained, above of population, sanctity, and infrastructure, had been converted at last into the final price of acquisition. Karen stood in the red-white glare of the binding and understood with sudden, exhausted clarity that the system had been dead the instant the Maelstrom whispered his name. Only now had the corpse realized it. The Noctis compass was bound to Huron's fleet, and Gethsemane Tertius had been condemned to pay for the chain. The Noctis compass opened the storm like a throat under the knife. Above dying Gethsemane Tertius, through a void still choked with burning hulks, tumbling defense plates, and the frozen bloom of vented dead, impossible lanes ignited across the black. They did not form with the uncertain shimmer of augur guesswork or sorcerous intuition. They arrived whole, stable, deliberate. Great arterial roads of bruise-colored light and corpse-pale geometry, visible only in flashes to mortal sight, yet screaming with certainty across every functioning relay and command shrine in Huron's fleet, routes where no route should have survived, passages through the Maelstrom's raging wound that had not existed an instant before, and now unfurled with obscene confidence between storm walls, wreck fields, and empiric torsion fronts that would have annihilated any lesser navigator who dared approach them. Across the pirate armada, machine spirits wailed and submitted, drive systems recalibrated, helm arrays seized and corrected themselves to impossible headings. Astropaths vomited blood onto their thrones as route sequences poured through them with the force of revelation. Captains who had expected to die in the collapsing void around the shrine world instead found safe vectors opening under their keels like predatory miracles. The Red Corsair fleet disengaged not in orderly retreat, but in a swift and ruthless extraction made possible by sudden certainty. Warships broke from contested lanes and plunged into the newborn passages. Ammunition, barges, slave carriers, butcher ships, and strike cruisers turned as one toward routes that should not have existed and were already beginning to feel inevitable. Wrecked escorts that could still answer helm were dragged into line by chain tugs. Boarding craft abandoned whatever plunder they could not carry and burned for the new lanes with holds packed full of stolen ammunition, captives, relics, and meat. The Widow's Gospel went with them, half-healed, bloodied, her hull still scarred and ugly beneath fresh layers of scavenged plate. Cargo lifts groaned in her holds under fresh shell pallets, fuel bladders, apothecarian crates and black caskets of reclaimed gene stock. The warband she carried had been resupplied as promised. It had also been reduced again, as always. More names gone. More armor slabs awaiting repainting or rendering. A few more brothers left behind in crypts, cathedral ruins, or the bellies of things that had no right to live. That was the nature of survival among the damned. One never escaped whole. One simply chose which losses would remain useful. Behind them, Gethsemane Tertius died in earnest. The shrine world had burned before. It had bled before. It had screamed through the whole campaign. Only now did it begin to understand extinction. The lower hive foundations, destabilized by the awakening and partial severance of the Noctis compass, gave way in chains of collapse that rippled through the primary cathedra hives, like fractures through old bone. Spires leaned, hesitated, then plunged through levels packed with refugees and defenders alike. Cathedral roofs tore apart in showers of saint statues. Molten bells and stained glass turned incandescent by the fires below. Processional roads split down their centers and vomited promethium flame, bones, crypt dust, and the whispering dead into the open air. Orbital firestorms still rained from above. Broken bastions and ruined stations descended like fragments of murdered moons. One impact erased an entire district in white fire and left only a bowl of slagged architecture around a field of shadows where millions had stood for an instant and then become outlines. Another struck a pilgrim arcology and toppled it into 3 neighbouring hab towers, turning all 4 into a continent of cascading masonry and screaming. The survivors, those few and momentary creatures stubborn enough to remain alive amid that end, inherited no mercy. Warp spill rolled out of the lower breaches in soft, unreal luminance that made flesh blister and time stumble. Xenos scavengers moved through the corpse system like careful knives and ecstatic vermin alike. Eldari skimmers cut through the high dark, taking only what they deemed necessary and slaying any Monkey still foolish enough to fire. Orc freebooters descended upon the breaking world in fresh waves, cheering each new collapse because it shook more loot loose from the dead. Captain Goraskull declared victory from the command gantry of his smoke-belching flagship, while a dozen of his crew fought over a crate they had not yet opened, and another set fire to a shrine bell because it made a satisfying sound when heated. "We won!" he roared, spreading his arms wide as burning debris fell beyond the view slits. "Look at it. Everything's broke. There's ships to nick, guns to nick, humies to stomp, shiny bits into dust, and a loud pointy gits didn't even kill me. Best raid ever." His first mate, missing one ear and wearing the severed arm of a Corsair captain as a belt trophy, nodded solemnly. "Proper win, boss. Tell all the lads I said so." This decree was relayed at once through various channels of violence, drunken shouting and accidental gunfire, and the Greenskins accepted it as strategic truth because there was no evidence loud enough to dispute it. Prince Iriel did not remain to argue outcomes with beasts. He escaped the corpse system with only fragments of his purpose intact and more blood upon his hands than he had intended to spend. His elite had been cut down in the Vault War. His strike had failed to destroy the engine. Yet he had broken flesh from Huron's inner circle and marked the Pirate King's victory with wounds that would not heal cleanly. Garyon lay dead because of him. Terminators and chosen corpses floated among the chamber wreckage and the upper void. Whole Corsair lines had been severed under his knives. It was not enough. It was something. Upon the bridge of his own vessel, as the last of his hunters withdrew along secret vectors through the collapsing war zone, Iriel stood in silence while spirit runes dimmed one by one around him. A lieutenant approached and bowed his head. "The mechanism survives." "For now," Iriel said. His voice was as cold as the spaces between stars, but beneath that cold lived a rage so disciplined it had become more dangerous than heat. He looked once toward the new storm lanes spreading from the red. Corsair Exodus felt the altered shape of the region in the skeins of fate, and understood exactly how much worse the Mon-K problem had become. "Mark every root their carcass king has birthed," he said. "This debt remains. I will collect it from his empire one bleeding rib at a time." Elsewhere, aboard the Blood Requital, Dagon Varkas watched the fleet extraction in hard silence and felt no triumph worthy of the word. The campaign had succeeded. The objective had been seized. The fleet was escaping through stable routes wrested from the storm by force and atrocity. Entire Imperial corridors would now lie vulnerable to strikes no admiral could predict and no merchant prince could insure against. By all the old measures of pirate war, this was glory enough to intoxicate lesser men. Dagon felt only the weight of the blade he had helped sharpen. He stood over the hololithic roots, their new impossible geometries pulsing across his command deck, and knew with the exhausted clarity of a practical butcher that he had not merely won a raid. He had placed into Huron's hand a far longer knife for the Imperium's ribs. Everything to come would be worse because this had worked. Worlds beyond counting would now lie open to predation from directions they believed impossible. That understanding should have delighted him. Instead, it tasted like responsibility, and responsibility was a thing he trusted less than hatred. A wounded raider beside him, one arm newly augmetic and still smoking faintly at the seals, gave a raw laugh. "We took the world's heart and walked away." Dagon kept his eyes on the roots. "No, we took its throat and taught our master where to cut the next one." On the Widow's Gospel, Karen Vale walked the repopulated silence of his strike cruiser and counted absence by instinct. The ship smelled stronger now. Ammunition oil, preservative chemicals from the gene stock vaults, freshly bled coolant, new slaves driven into old corridors. It ought to have felt like renewal. Instead, it felt like every other survival he had ever endured. A temporary strength laid over the older truth of erosion. Sev Drask survived with 3 cracked ribs, one eye half blinded by splinter damage, and a delighted contempt for the whole campaign. "Worth it," he said from the apothecarian slab, where he refused to lie still while Morval worked. "We gained shells, seed, stories, and a prince's hatred. You cannot buy a better week." Varjast, one pauldron gone and a whole section of flank plate replaced by raw patchwork, grunted from the next operating frame. "We also lost Talek, Ren, both the Cord brothers, 38 mortal hands, the Eastern gun crew, and what remained of your good eye. I was wasted on symmetry." Morval did not bother looking up from the progenoid canisters he was indexing. "You were wasted generally. Hold still." His surgical tools moved over the warband's new stores, with hungry satisfaction. Gene stock from Huron's vaults, harvested organs recovered from the dead, chemical stabilizers and medici compounds enough to sustain the warband a while longer. Enough, never abundance. Enough was the only luxury the damned ever really saw. Karen let them speak and listened instead to the low hum beneath the hull, to the altered pressure in his skull whenever the newborn storm lanes flared on the ship's sensors. The compass had touched him, more than touched him. It had marked him. He could feel it now when he closed his eyes. Threads in the dark, roots half seen, the old voice in the storm not gone, only quieter because it no longer needed to shout. What he had seen was not over. It had only changed scale. Huron Blackheart declared as much before the fleet had fully cleared the corpse system. His order went out to every captain, Reaver Lord, Master of Guns, Slave Baron, and Warband Chief still able to receive it. No boasting, no piety, no indulgent speech over the dead of Gethsemane Tertius, merely a statement of appetite. "This campaign was the first cut," he said, "not the kill. Refit, tally your losses, discipline your holds, and prepare new target priorities. The Imperium still believes distance protects it. We will correct that belief." Already the planning began. New raids, new tithe routes to strangle, new shrine worlds and convoy chains exposed by the compass's first bleeding gift. Captains bent over route projections while the ashes of Gethsemane still glowed behind them. That was Huron's genius and his obscenity both. No victory was an end state. Every triumph was only a sharper beginning. Karen received a private summons before the fleet vanished fully into the fresh lanes. He found Huron in a chamber deep within the tyrant's flagship, not a throne hall this time, but a strategic sanctum of iron walls, dim hololithic light and restraint so severe it felt more intimate than luxury ever could. No cheering courtiers, no crowded bodyguard tiers, only 2 terminators outside the sealed hatch, and the low machine pulse of systems still adapting to the forced union with the Noctis compass. Huron stood rather than sat when Karen entered. The binding had cost him. That much was plain even to one who hated him. Additional cables now fed into the ruined architecture of his chest and spine. One side of his gorget had been re-armored in haste. Fresh blood had dried in dark seams around the augmetic interfaces. Yet his gaze was bright, focused and amused in the manner of a blade discovering it still had edge. "You are leaving," Huron said. "We have what was promised." and fewer brothers than when you came. Karen's expression did not shift. That is how numbers behave in wars like yours. Huron gave a quiet sound that might have been agreement. And yet you stay alive, a quality I continue to value. Karen looked toward the dim, storm route projections, hanging in the air behind him. You value what can still be spent. That is another way of defining life. For a moment, neither spoke. The ship hummed around them. Somewhere far below, a bound mechanism recalculated routes through damnation and fed them into fleet logic with the calm obedience of something that hated its work and could not refuse it. At last, Karen said, "You have not built a refuge in the Maelstrom. No." Huron's smile was slight and terrible. "Refugees are for men hoping not to be found. You built a market." Huron's eyes narrowed by a fraction, not in anger, but in recognition that the other man had reached the thing cleanly. "A living economy," Karen continued, "of violence, transit, hunger, and fear. Worlds will bleed so ships can move. Ships will move so worlds can bleed. You have chained a storm and mistaken the chain for ownership." Huron stepped nearer, iron joints whispering. "Ownership is always temporary. That is why one uses it quickly. The thing below wanted you. I wanted it more." Karen held his gaze. "For now." That earned him a genuine smile, the kind that never reached anything human in the face wearing it. For now is the only empire anyone ever truly governs. He turned away then, already half lost again in route displays and future predations. Dismissal without insult. Trust of a kind. Or simple certainty that Karen would leave with what he had gained and return one day, if need and appetite aligned properly enough. At the hatch, Huron spoke once more without looking back. "The storm called you before it called me." Karen stopped. "I know," Huron said. "That interests me." Karen said nothing. There was no answer worth giving that would not sound like concession, denial, or warning, and he intended none of them. He left the sanctum with the old pressure stirring behind his eyes, and the certainty that Huron's curiosity was nearly as dangerous as his ambition. When the widow's gospel finally broke from close escort and entered one of the new storm lanes, the Maelstrom opened around her in colors no sane navigator would ever have trusted. The route held. Of course it held. That was the horror. Through walls of screaming empiric weather, through folds of ruined light and drifts of fleet dead older than some kingdoms, the cruiser ran upon a road mapped by martyrdom, piracy, and imprisoned intelligence. Karen stood upon the observation deck alone and watched the lane burn ahead. He saw more than the deck display showed him. Fragments, futures, a convoy line igniting far from here, another shrine world choking under a midnight raid, orc hulks riding the edges of the same routes like scavenger moons, Eldari knives returning from the dark, Huron's fleets multiplying their wounds across sectors not yet aware that geometry itself had just betrayed them. His own warband, smaller again, harder again, stalking, through someone else's extinction. The visions had not ended. The compass had reached into him and left one of its hooks behind. Outside the armor glass, the new routes spread across the dark like veins opening under pale skin. Pirate fleets moved through them in black-red procession, each vessel a hungry thing carrying guns, slaves, ambition, and the certainty that distance no longer meant safety. Behind them, Gethsemane Tertius collapsed into ruin and fire, until even its screams were swallowed by the storm. Ahead of them lay whole sectors still lit with routine traffic, still full of tithes, prayers, schedules, complacencies, and the idiotic peace of populations who believed the map protected them. It did not. Across the void, unseen by those condemned to live beneath it, new storm roads unfurled from the Maelstrom toward the wider Imperium, and whole regions of mankind, not yet warned and not yet burning, had already been sentenced.